Please take your seats. Please welcome Arthi Rao, Director of the Global Climate Policy Project at the Salada Institute.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Harvard Climate Symposium. My name is Arthi Rao, and I'm the Director of the Global Climate Policy Project at Harvard and MIT. We have an exciting global program for you today. Together, we will explore the critical intersections of international trade and climate change, discuss climate adaptation pathways in West Africa and beyond, and sketch pathways for international climate policy. We gather at a defining moment for this work. Despite growing momentum for clean energy investments in many countries, global emissions remain far too high, and climate damages are mounting. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement have established an important foundation for climate action, but efforts to date have proven insufficient to manage the risks of a changing climate. Recent developments, including the withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement, make clear that relying on global consensus to advance collective climate goals is not by itself enough. The world needs new ideas, new strategies, and new ways to transform insight from the academy into action, and action into lasting climate progress. The Global Climate Policy Project at Harvard and MIT was formed to help meet that need. This initiative brings together leading academics, policymakers, industry experts, and members of civil society to shape the global dialogue and accelerate urgent climate action. And today we are unveiling a new roadmap for a climate coalition. Our flagship report, published earlier this week, details how a voluntary coalition of countries coordinating carbon prices could slash global emissions and raise billions of dollars for mitigation and adaptation. It offers a pathway to decarbonize heavy industry, no matter the pace of global consensus in the UN process, and in a way that responds to developing economy priorities. You will hear more in just a few minutes from leading policymakers and experts, many of whom participated in the international working group convened by the Global Climate Policy Project to produce this report. The report is available on the Salada Institute homepage, or you can find it in the event app. While we certainly encourage you to read the report, I also suggest that you wait until a break to do so. You won't want to miss any of what today's speakers have to say. Thank you very much.
And now, welcome our moderator, Catherine Wolfram, William Barton Rogers Professor in Energy and Professor of Applied Economics, MIT Sloan School of Management, and Faculty Co-Lead, Global Climate Policy Project. Cristina Reis, Deputy Secretary for Sustainable Economic Development, Brazilian Ministry of Finance. Ignacio García Bercero, Non-Resident Fellow, Bruegel. Daouda Sembene, President and CEO, AfriCatalyst. And joining us by Zoom, Pangestu, Special Envoy of the President of Indonesia for International Trade and Multilateral Cooperation, Professor of International Economics, University of Indonesia.
Thank you all for starting your Saturday morning with us. Before we get to this amazing panel, I wanted to start with a few more words on the report that Arthi just described. So you may wonder why now? Why are we thinking about a climate coalition now? I think there are two main reasons. One is that, as this panel will hopefully address, we are seeing rising interest in the global community about carbon pricing. We're seeing more and more countries adopting carbon pricing, particularly carbon pricing for the heavy industries that the report highlights. In those industries, over 80% of the emissions are already covered by carbon pricing. So there's a real opportunity to raise ambition in these policies. And the second is I think it's clear that we need to think about policies beyond the consensus-based approach. So in addition to the UNFCCC and COP, we need to be thinking about things that a subset of countries can do together. So the purpose of the report was to lay out a framework and a really concrete set of steps that policymakers can think about following in order to form this coalition. So for instance, we articulate what we see as the 3 most important decisions that a small group of countries would need to make about the climate coalition, which are how to set the carbon prices, how to think about the border adjustments, and incentives for low and middle income countries in addition to potentially differentiated carbon prices. A bit on the process, the report was written under the auspices of a committee of economists that was convened by the president of COP, Ambassador Andrea Correia do Lago. Apologies to Cristina if I'm mispronouncing the Brazilian name. And the panel of economists is chaired by José Schenkman, a very notable Brazilian economist. Under the auspices of that committee, we convened a working group, and both Mari and Daouda were part of that working group. The working group included thought leaders from the major emitting countries, and we really had a set of robust discussions in advance of the report and to put together the report. So the panelists have already been introduced. Let's get to the meat of this. We had a very lively discussion yesterday at dinner, so I'm hoping that we can replicate that tonight, or this morning. So let me start with Ignacio. I want to ask Ignacio about the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. I want to say a bit about what CBAM does. As many of you may know, the European Union now has an emissions trading system and applies a carbon price to the power sector, to the industrial sectors, for production within the borders of the EU. Starting in 2026, January 1st, 2026, not many months from now, the EU will impose a border adjustment on imports in those industries into the EU. So if you are a steel producer in Malaysia exporting to the European Union, you'll have to pay a border adjustment consistent with the amount of emissions associated with the production of your steel. But, and this is a crucial but, the Malaysian steel producer, any exporter, will be credited with a carbon price that they've already paid domestically. And so this has really led to an increase in interest in other countries thinking about carbon pricing. So this is all by way of lead up, because I want to ask Ignacio about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which he was involved in intimately in its early days. So can you elaborate a bit on the rationale behind the CBAM and describe what's happening with it right now and how you see an EU CBAM interacting with the climate coalition?
Yeah. No, thanks a lot, Catherine, for having me here. In a way, I think you have already explained the key elements of CBAM, but fundamentally the decision why the European Union thought it had to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism was realizing that the experience under the ETS, while it had been quite positive in decarbonizing the power sector, had only had a very limited impact in decarbonizing heavy industrial sectors. And the main reason for that was because industries got their allowances largely for free. So if you actually wanted to achieve the net zero objectives, you had to be able to phase out free allowances. And of course, as you phase out free allowances, you needed to have an alternative way to deal with the concerns about carbon leakage. So that was the fundamental idea behind the introduction of CBAM, ensuring the integrity of the decarbonization commitments for heavy industries, and at the same time trying to design the CBAM in a manner that responded to the principle of non-discrimination. That is to say, the carbon price imposed on importers should not be higher than the one which is imposed domestically, and all importers from third countries should be subject to the same carbon price. Now, of course, taking into account that if a carbon price had already been paid at the exporting side, for reasons of fairness, that price should be discounted. So that's the basic rationale behind CBAM. I mean, as you know, initially it was introduced only as a reporting mechanism and would only become applied as a charge from 2026. But another important element to bear in mind is that until 2030, the CBAM would be a very, very small charge, because it's only really in 2030 where there's a big reduction of free allowances. I mean, free allowances initially are phased out at a very, very slow pace, but by 2030, 50% of the allowances obtained by European Union industry, they will have to pay for it. So it's only starting from 2030 that the CBAM will become a significant charge. And I'm saying that because it also gives some hints about the interaction between CBAM and the climate coalition. If you actually want to see what would be a time frame so that CBAM could become for the participants, so that the climate coalition could become for the participants an alternative for CBAM, you need to be thinking about having the system which is more or less operational by 2029, basically speaking. Now, at this point in time, there are a number of important decisions that the European Union would need to take on CBAM. Some of these are technical in nature, but very important. There's going to be some refinement of the methodologies for monitoring, reporting, and verification. I mean, they were introduced during the trial phase, but now that CBAM is going to be applied, they will be further simplified and refined. My understanding with the idea, this is not necessarily the last word, but as more experience is gained, you can continue improving your MRBs for the implementation of CBAM. There's going to be some determination about how to ensure that third country carbon prices are effectively discounted. My sense is that the European Union is likely to be quite inclusive in terms of what counts as a carbon price system that can be considered for the purpose of crediting. I know, for instance, that the very recent Indian system, the CTS, which is a very, very incipient carbon price, earlier this week, the European Commission already said that this would be a type of system that could be credited under CBAM, so my impression will be quite inclusive in terms of different terms of carbon prices. But at the same time, I think it's important to bear in mind that the current political context in the European Union is one in which there is a lot of concerns about the competitiveness of European Union industry. And that, I think, is inevitably going to color a lot of the discussions also about the implementation of CBAM and how to deal with the situation in some key sectors like the steel sector. There's going to be a lot of discussions about green industrial policies, something which you're, of course, very familiar with in the United States. There's going to be discussions about whether CBAM should be extended to downstream products, what to do about export competitiveness, because CBAM only compensates for imports, but there's nothing there in terms of what happens on the export side. And there's going to be discussions about how to avoid what is called resource shuffling. And for me, the real interest about this climate coalition, if we are looking into those issues, a climate coalition, if it is well designed and politically workable, will be much, much more efficient to respond to those type of concerns than a purely unilateral CBAM applied by a very limited number of countries. So potentially, I think there's a big opportunity there.
Wonderful, thank you. So Cristina, Brazil will host COP30, and finance ministries are at the center of the coalition design. Why does Brazil see this conversation as timely and important, and how do fairness and inclusivity come into play?
All right, good morning. Bom dia. It's a pleasure to be here. Catherine, thank you very much for the invitation. I want to congratulate you and Arati for the GCPP report, which is brilliant, and indeed it brings a lot of technical support to the COP's presidency. Before answering your question, I just wanted to say that together with fighting climate change, we need to stand against any kind of war and violence. So it's time also to defeat peace and peacemaking, and I think we all here agree with this. So talking about the coalition on carbon markets, this is a priority for the Ministry of Finance, because we think that this COP30 in Belém, can become a reference for two reasons. First, this is the implementation COP. So after 10 years of Paris Agreement, we have the chance to really start implementing things. So the Global Action Agenda of COP presidency has 30 priorities. And besides that, talking about implementation, the ministers of finance have a big role. Yeah, my microphone was a bit weird. I'm sorry about this. So the Ministry of Finance Brazil is pushing a hard agenda that we call the Ecological Transformation Plan, and it has 3 priorities in terms of international agenda. The first is the Tropical Forests Forever Facility, which will have a big announcement, hopefully next week in New York. The second one is the Super Taxonomy, which intends to promote interoperability between taxonomies. And the third one is the Open Coalition, the topic we are talking about here. And we think that the coalition on carbon markets and establishing harmonization of MRV standards for some key sectors that are being discussed in your report can bring fairness and inclusivity to the explicitly to the way that we shape carbon markets. Because fairness, it means improving the income distribution between countries, between groups of peoples within the countries, between people of different genders and race and acting differently in the territory. So carbon markets can provide new pathways to develop sectors and projects related to agriculture, forestry, and waste management, sectors that are relevant for low-income countries that, for instance, through offsets can be developed. We think that pushing very hard the agenda and showing that the finance ministers can develop the funding instruments, tax and fiscal instruments, regulatory instruments, and also management and monitoring instruments, we can finally achieve our common commitment in fighting climate change.
Wonderful. Very ambitious goals, and yeah, we are delighted to be supporting them. Mari, thank you for joining us. I know it's late on a Saturday night in Indonesia. So Indonesia has been grappling with the balance between industrial growth and climate ambition. From your perspective, how could a coalition help countries like Indonesia pursue both development and scaling carbon pricing?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. I wish I could be there with all of you, but here I am, at least in spirit, with all of you. Well, as you know, for developing countries like Indonesia, the issue of challenges between development and climate is always there. But I think we believe that we can achieve economic growth, and it is not a trade-off with climate. In fact, the real trade-off is inaction now versus action now. But we have the challenges ahead of us, because in the short to medium term, we have still challenges in terms, especially for energy transition. I think we're making quite good progress with our FOLU and our reduction in deforestation and reducing emissions from forest fires. But our fossil fuel-intensive economic architecture, where industry and energy sectors are emitting almost 60% of the national emission in 2023, obviously remains a big challenge for us to be able to shift to a low-carbon economy, which is the intention of all of us in Indonesia and the new government. So, you know, we're talking about high transition costs, increased risks associated with green business, and unintended distributional impacts on those in the lowest income deciles. So we really see the value of a coalition on carbon pricing with respect to border carbon adjustments, because it will really offer a way forward for us. So instead of punishing Indonesian industries in export markets like the EU, the coalition, we hope, will be able to provide us with a better level playing field. And our producers can therefore avoid fragmented CBAM-style tariffs and gain market access on much fairer terms. So for Indonesia, the coalition membership really could unlock positive incentives, give us access and incentives to low carbon technologies, joint ventures with global firms, concessional climate finance from the coalition's revenue recycling, and harmonized standards that accelerate industrial upgrading. So, I mean, we see a lot of positives in terms of the membership in the coalition. And hopefully, as you know, Indonesia is very much focusing on downstreaming ambitions like nickel, electric vehicles, battery and storage, green steel, and hopefully this will allow our downstreaming ambitions to be more aligned with the global markets while scaling carbon pricing at home. And you were mentioning that countries are now increasing the use of carbon pricing. We are also now in the midst of coming up with revising our regulations on carbon markets and carbon pricing. So hopefully we can see decarbonization not as a trade-off, and the coalition reframes it really as a development advantage that we hope can attract capital, secure market access, and really strengthen our resilience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Daouda, let's turn to you and see if some similar themes come up to what Mari described. Can you tell us what you see as the key opportunities for emerging economies, particularly clean producers in Africa in such a coalition?
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here in the Salata Institute. But it was also an honor to be part of the working group that actually came out with this report, along with Mary and other distinguished thought leaders. To respond to your question, I think I see several opportunities for carbon pricing, sort of a coalition for developing countries, particularly low-income countries in Africa. As you know, I think when you take, for instance, the case of Africa, all 54 countries sign up on the Paris Agreement, and the vast majority of those countries ratified the agreement. And of course, any way that they can sort of make progress toward those commitments under the Paris Agreement would be very much welcome. And actually being part of a climate coalition gives you that opportunity because it allows you to mobilize more climate finance for collective action, collective climate action, and I think this would be very much helpful for many low-income countries, particularly in Africa. And how so? I think we talked about it, Mary, or also Cristina talked about it. The fact that the coalition would be able to very much get part of the revenue that are derived from the border carbon adjustment mechanism to pull those funds and be able to sort of make them available to some of those countries, the low-income countries, would be very much welcome. That's one. And I think this would be aligned with, I think, one of the key goals of the Paris Agreement, which is the new collective quantify goal that actually sort of dictate that some of the resources that these developing countries needs to be sort of mobilized and allocated to them. So I think a coalition would contribute to that. A second opportunity that I also see is beyond the fact that actually collectively there would be mobilization of climate finance. Through the domestic carbon pricing, actually countries are able to mobilize their own revenue that they can use to push for green growth objectives. So whether it is to mobilize financing to sort of finance climate resilient infrastructure, whether it is actually also to be able to promote green industrialization, or also actually push their energy transition agenda, this would be actually something that a climate coalition can allow you. And one last opportunity I would also see is, I think when we talked about the EU CBAM, I think being part of the climate coalition would give you the opportunity to respond in a multilateral setting. If you take any low-income country individually to, if they have to respond to the EU CBAM, I think that would be quite limited. But if they are part of a coalition, I think they can strategize and have a more sort of effective collective response to the EU CBAM, and I think this is something that is important. And one last point that I would make also is, I think if you take the case of many African countries, one of the key concerns that actually a lot of countries would have is why would they be part of, why would they introduce any carbon pricing mechanism. The reality is you take many African countries, particularly those that we looked at in the report, they do have actually some comparative advantage in the sense that I think they are able to produce all of those emission-intensive products by relying very much on clean sources of energy, like hydropower. You take a case like Mozambique, for instance. They sort of produce a lot of aluminium, using a lot of hydro power to do so. So I think that would give them some sort of comparative advantage that they can use. And of course, the fact that many of them also are using a big part of their product or their production to export it outside Africa. I think this is something that also needs to be taken into account, which means that they could be very much more competitive and actually very much take the benefit related to being part of climate coalition.
Wonderful, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the point about kind of strength in numbers rather than negotiating bilaterally with the EU. So coalition provides a strong multilateral face. So I want to turn next to unpacking some of the proposal's key parameters. One thing that we do is sketch out what different pricing agreements could look like, and then model what those impacts could be on trade and on production in the various sectors. And so we consider a couple of different scenarios, one of which, different from the EU, allows for a graduated pricing approach so that lower income countries get credit for exports to the EU at, say, 3 times the carbon price that they're paying, and middle income countries get credit at maybe 1.5 times the price that they're paying. Those numbers are just illustrative. Of course, that would be something that the policymakers would have to decide on. But I want to kind of dig into some of the dimensions of the report and some of the recommendations it has around climate finance, as Daouda brought up. So let me turn first to Cristina. And the report really emphasizes the large fiscal revenues that the coalition participation could generate. How might those revenues be used in ways that both strengthen domestic economies and that build political support for climate ambition?
Yeah, I think Daouda was starting to answer this question. So the report says that the coalition may raise annually around $200 billion, right? And so the key answer for this regards revenue recycling. So this recycling can focus on at least 3 topics. First, on developing low carbon technologies. So we need to provide access to those technologies in low income economies so that also micro and small enterprises can access these sort of technologies. We need to provide capacity and also fundraising, secondly. And so we have to finance the development of these technologies so that the technological dependency diminishes. And talking about this, so part of these revenues could be allocated into a trust fund, maybe managed by a MDB, so there be continuously sources of funding to develop those technologies in low-income countries. And the other thing that I was mentioning before is in terms of the potential of offsets. So if the coalition allows for offsets, and if we develop methodologies that will ensure integrity and effectiveness of new programs and projects, generating carbon credits related to other sectors, no usual sectors, to agriculture, as I was saying, as forestry, as waste management, and so forth, so we can develop the productive structure of these countries, right, of low-income countries in special. So, but we can go beyond, as Ignacio was saying, the way that we allocate free allowances, the framework of these, the kind of exemptions, they are key to rechannel the way that the investment is going to go, and so we can develop the productive structure toward sectors that bring more and better dynamics for employment, for decent jobs, and for income in low-income countries. So I'm pretty optimistic that the Open Coalition will have this magnetic effect, both in economic, political, environmental, and climate dimensions that will benefit all.
I love that term, the magnetic, that it can start with just a few countries, but eventually attract more and more countries. Thanks so much. Let me turn next to Mari. Could you talk about things that you think would make the coalition particularly attractive for low and middle income countries, and particularly for Indonesia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can think of a couple of benefits or carrots, if you like, that would make the coalition be attractive for developing countries like Indonesia. And they need to be seen as tangible economic benefits. I think Christine already mentioned technology transfers, and that's definitely attraction for Indonesia, given the challenges we have with energy transition and so on. So removing barriers to trade, for instance, in clean technologies, would really be beneficial for us. And how how can we promote joint R&D as well as supporting industrial scale demonstration projects within those technology transfer initiatives. Other benefits could be preferential market access. The coalition members can avoid the border carbon adjustments when trading with each other, which I think will be a strong incentive for exporters in the lower middle income countries, as well as I think already mentioned from Africa. I think another benefit obviously is finance. A share of I think it was already mentioned, the coalition revenues is quite significant, and they could be earmarked for concession loans, guarantees, or grants by a trust fund, as was already mentioned. And that will really help. We all talk about how much how much we have to scale up the cost of climate finance, and to be able to create platforms where blended finance can come in, and the concessional funding and grants would really help to crowd in more private sector finance. And then there's also the potential benefit of capacity building. Many low middle income countries really have to beef up their capacity with regard to the methodology of MRV systems. And this is all improving very rapidly, and we really need capacity building there. And really also would really be benefit from technical assistance, digital platforms, and the training that will build trust and lowers the entry barriers. And finally, I think transparent and inclusive governance do matter. So for low middle income countries, to have a seat at the table with high income countries, ensuring the coalition is not perceived as a rich country club, like the Kyoto Protocol was perceived, but rather as a truly cooperative framework under the Paris Agreement. I think that would be a real benefit for us, because we really believe that we need to be a part of the conversation and not just be a recipient of whatever comes out of the developed countries' conversations.
Thank you. Daouda, same question to you. What do you see as aspects that could make the coalition more attractive for low and middle income countries?
Well, Catherine, after Mary and Cristina, I don't think I have much to add to this question, but I would say this. I think one critical issue that needs to be looked at if we want to make a climate coalition inclusive is to learn from previous experience and see what didn't work. I think when you're talking from the perspective of low-income countries or in many middle-income countries, I think the time is now done when actually they would join coalitions or organizations just for the sake of joining in without getting the adequate voice and representation. So what it means is, from the principle, guiding the creation of the coalition. We need to make sure that those principles are not only fair, they are also very much inclusive. They also promote actually sort of inclusivity of all of the members. I think that's a critical part. We also need to make sure that the governance framework, as Mary was saying, is strong enough. Why? Because if you really want to make sure that any low-income country or middle-income country find it beneficial to join the coalition, they would need to know that actually their voice would be heard. But also the governance framework is adaptable enough, is flexible enough, is also very much strong and transparent enough for them, of course, to very much take the benefit out of it. I think this is critical, and this is something that is in the report that also is proposed by the report. So that would be very much important. One last thing that I think is critical that makes the coalition attractive would be, of course, to add all of those incentives for low-income countries to join in. So that those incentives actually should be well designed in such a way that a country would say that, well, I am better off joining this coalition than actually staying on my own. So what are those incentives? I think the fact that, of course, you would help those countries actually mobilize more climate finance than they would not be able to do if they remain on their own. This is critical. Not only actually what they are mobilizing from domestic carbon pricing schemes, but also what the coalition itself is mobilizing collectively through the BCA scheme to put it, make it available to members. I think whether it is through the trust funds that MDBs would sort of manage, whether it is through other means, but the reality is if you have a way that the coalition would very much make it available for those countries to very much, promote and accelerate their green growth agenda, I think that could be very much helpful. Another way, of course, is when you talked about many low-income countries, particularly in Africa, there is a lot of capacity constraint and weaknesses when it comes to designing and implementing proper carbon pricing mechanism. So if you have a coalition that sort of provide that type of institutional capacity building, that's very much welcome, because then the country would be able to join, but not only join, but know that as they join, they would receive the type of support that is needed for them to very much design and implement very much strong carbon pricing sort of scheme. I think this is very much critical. And one last thing, of course, as Mary said in the case of Indonesia, if this coalition or any coalition, climate coalition, give the opportunities for countries to be able to accelerate the adoption of clean technologies, I think that can only be an additional incentive for them to join.
Great. Before I go to Ignacio, let me warn the audience that after Ignacio responds, I'd like to go for questions. So please think about questions that you'd like to ask of this illustrious panel. I also wanted, so a couple of panelists have brought up the idea of the trust fund. So let me just give an example of things that we think the trust fund could invest in. So we're trying to decarbonize these heavy industries, aluminum, steel, cement. Perhaps the trust fund could have, dedicated investments in low carbon steel in Senegal and, members of the coalition. And so that would both help Senegal decarbonize steel, but also encourage Senegal to adopt a carbon price because the targets of the carbon price would see that they would be supported in the decarbonization path. All right, Ignacio, based on your experience designing CBAM, what are some of the challenges that you think the coalition might face?
No, thanks a lot, Catherine. And let me start by saying that I hope very much that the European Union would be ready to negotiate to develop this coalition. I think it's a great idea. At the same time, let's be clear, the rules that will have to be negotiated are going to be both technically difficult and politically challenging. I will just mention what I think, from my point of view, are the 5 key questions that will have to be negotiated. And I will mention them a little bit also from what I see a European perspective. Now, the most difficult issue is going to be, of course, to be able to agree on a differentiated carbon price mechanism, which at the same time responds to the concerns about carbon leakage that underlie the CBAM. Taking as an assumption what appears in the report, $25 per ton for low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, $50 per ton for middle-income countries, $75 for high-income countries. I could see a way that something like this could work from the European Union perspective if at the same time there's an agreement that countries would be charging at the border the difference between the domestic price and the price which applies in the high-income countries. So let's take the case of India. We have just introduced a very rudimentary carbon market scheme. According to some estimates, probably less than $10 per ton. Now, this would imply that by, let's say, 2030, India would have moved its carbon price to something around $25 per ton, and it would be charging in exports to the European Union, assuming that we still stay around $80 to $100 per ton, the differential export tax. Now, this, of course, would have the advantage of very significant revenue generation for India, and it would also, at the same time, allay any concerns about this couldn't result in carbon leakage in the European Union. I think that that could be a solution that, in my view, could work. In principle, I could also imagine this working for middle-income countries, with the possible exception of China. I think there will have to be a conversation with China to see where China, because of the high impact of their emissions on the environment, because of the very competitive position that they have developed in the green economy, whether it would be ready to accept that it would not be benefiting from this preferential differentiated carbon pricing, and it would actually become a net financial contributor to the trust fund. But that would be an important conversation to have with India. But I mention it because, again, it gives an illustration of some of the politically difficult issues that would have to be tackled. I will mention the others much more briefly, because I think this is, in my view, is the core and the more difficult one. Transparency is going to be key, because it's basically implied that you accept that it's going to be the exporting country that will be in charge of actually collecting the revenue and showing how the revenue is going to be used, and showing that there's no under-reporting by firms. So I think that having a strong transparency mechanism is going to be extremely important. That's why I think, quite frankly, even among members of the coalition, you would need to have an agreement on MRBs, which is necessary, would need to be monitored at the company level, because it would not be enough just to simply rely on aggregate data. I think it's also going to be important that whatever is done maintains the WTO compatibility. So that implies that vis-à-vis countries which are not members of the coalition, you should not be imposing a charge which is higher than the one that you apply domestically. Just to give you an example, that's why I have a reservation with an idea in the report that no matter what is your domestic carbon price, vis-à-vis non-members, you would apply a $75 per ton. I don't think that you could actually justify it as being WTO compatible. And finally, I think it's going to be important that the coalition doesn't look only into carbon price. Carbon price is very important, but it's not the only solution. If you want to be able to decarbonize sectors like steel, you are going to have to combine a carbon price with well-targeted subsidies, with the development of lead markets, all the ideas relating to green industrial policies. And I think, in my view, this also has to be part of the conversation among the members of the coalition. I also agree that governance is key. I mean, this is a very, very ambitious type of agreement. You will need to have a very sophisticated governance mechanism with proper monitoring. So it's quite a challenge. It's a very exciting challenge, but I just wanted to indicate that it's not going to be something that one can easily solve. It's going to require a lot of preparation and some hard negotiations.
And Catherine, I think we better listen, because actually Ignacio has been reading from his green book.
The green book for the environment. Cristina, one.
May I add something? Yeah, definitely. This is a very ambitious idea. It is not new, though, so there are theoretical and practical experiences of carbon pricing integration. So look into Europe. It's so complex, and when you made it, people were a bit like, they wouldn't believe that this could work, and it's working pretty well, right? And we look to California and Quebec and to other jurisdictions. So there are practical examples that this sort of integration works. And now, as we were talking now, we need to bring all as much as countries we can, because otherwise, in the future, if everybody is working alone, there'll be many C-bands around, and trade and investment will have problems to flow, right? So we need to start planning now how we're going to work together regarding carbon pricing. And our intent in COP Belém is to announce by a declaration of the coalition, and we can discuss further and better all these political and technical difficulties together and with that. But I'm sure that there are plenty of nice people trying to do so. I'm pretty much optimistic that we can announce an open coalition within a couple of weeks, actually, because it's time for that. We have accumulated knowledge and experience, and we need this. We need now to talk about MRV standards, offset usage, and carbon accounting at the product level. I pretty much agree with you. So let's do it together.
Let's do it. I like that. It's an exciting challenge. I like that. All right, so I guess I see a question here already. The question says, what has the reaction been to the proposal from people in the US, people in the rest of the world? Maybe I'll say a bit about that and then turn to other panelists who might have comments. My impression has been that the US isn't really paying attention to this. The US has a lot going on in lots of spheres, and so that might be a good thing. I think this does not need to involve the US right now, and so let's get interested countries together to talk about it, and when the US is ready, maybe the US will think about it. Yeah, other reactions that people have heard?
I would say that, we are at the juncture where the time for global consensus, unfortunately, has been waning, and it's going to be waning for the foreseeable future. So you cannot get anything done through the usual channel of the UN and others, unfortunately. So what you really need to is these type of coalitions of, like-minded countries and sort of governments and actors to get together and push for this, these climate goals to be actually achieved. So this is definitely something that in the rest of the world, actually, there is a lot of interest in trying to see against the backdrop of a multipolar and pragmatic world, how countries can get together with other like-minded institutions, whether they are advanced economies, whether they are emerging market or developing economies, but all get together to push for climate action to be, to happen.
Well, I can tell a little bit about what's going on in the activation group related to this initiative and the COP30 presidency. So the group has members such as VCMI, SCVCN, defense, not jurisdictions, not countries. And I can say that in general, the reaction is very positive. They see the value of the initiative. Of course, members are worried about the technical and the political difficulties and how we're going to approach the jurisdictions. So next week, also in New York, there will be a meeting with many jurisdictions, and we hope to explain better and to further discuss the idea with them now, and then later I can answer you what's the answer of the rest of the world.
Ignacio.
Well, just one piece of advice. I mean, I'm totally outside government anymore, so I'm not really qualified to say what is the reaction of anyone. But one piece of advice, I mean, I think it would be great if this initiative can be launched at the COP. I would advise don't rush to move into a negotiating phase too quickly. There's a lot of trust building that needs to be done. There's a lot of technical work that needs to be prepared before you actually start the hard negotiations on the rules. My sense is that, quite frankly, probably the moment when those negotiations could start will be around 2028. And then let's see what happens later in 2028. Because for me, ideally, it would be good. You cannot wait until the US is ready to join any exercise like this, but you should not be close to the possibility of a future US administration being ready to join. And the more that it is bear in mind of the countries which are working on the coalition, the better. So I would say, let's try to get as inclusive as possible process with as many countries that are interested in the carbon price. Let's have serious discussion on all the technical issues. Let's try to maintain at the same time attention by leaders. I think there could be opportunities when leaders can make clear why they support this coalition and why they are ready to put their weight behind it. But let's not rush to try to negotiate this too early.
Great. So I see that we are in the red. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel, and please join me in hoping that we hear more and more about the coalition, both at COP30 and after.
Please welcome to the stage Megan O'Sullivan, the Jean Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School, and Bob Dudley, Chairman, Oil and Gas Climate Initiative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see so many people here on such a beautiful day. It's fantastic. It's my pleasure to be here with the Salada Institute and at Harvard's Climate Week, and a particular pleasure for me to introduce to you Bob Dudley. Bob spent more than 4 years in the energy industry, and
40.
Four. Yeah, much more. Well, 40 is more than 4, so 40 years in the energy industry, and 10 of those from 2010 to 2020 as the CEO of BP. Right now, he is the chair of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is a gathering of CEOs, a group of CEOs across the industry representing 30% of the world's oil and gas production. And these CEOs are joined together to collaborate on addressing climate change and bringing down emissions. So just a couple of words about Bob's career, because it really is a fascinating career filled with adventure, little controversy, and impact. And I say controversy, it goes back to your first day at Amoco. I remember in 1979 reading, I don't remember it in person, but reading that you had to work your way through protesters. That first day of work, of course, 1979 was the Iranian Revolution and the spike in oil prices and protesters saying, bring down big oil. So since that time, Bob has been engaged in the industry in so many different ways. He traveled and was posted in Scotland and in China and other places. In 2020, shortly after the BP bought Amoco, he worked closely with the CEO of BP at the time on the renewable practice of BP. And from there, he ended up running the BP joint venture in Russia, TNK-BP, and another posting that led to what could probably be a good movie script. He had to flee Russia over controversy, but then later came back and was critical to negotiating the selling of that deal. So in 2010, Bob was asked to take over the helm of BP. This was in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon crisis. And at that time, Bob described the moment as humbling. He spent several years focused on the safety culture, focused on cleaning up the Gulf, and focused on really right-sizing the company so that it could survive. After that, as the world shifted even more intensely to focus on climate change, Bob, still in his role as BP, founded the OGCI that we mentioned earlier. And has been an advocate for oil and gas companies playing a role in addressing climate change. I'll just read a one-sentence quote from Bob in 2019. He said, "The world is on an unsustainable path. We need a faster transition to low-carbon energy system and a net zero emissions world." And under his watch, BP again started to invest in renewables. I'd like to delve into some of these issues with Bob on stage and look forward to your questions. But for the moment, please join me again in welcoming Bob.
Thank you so much. Can I, a little anecdote?
Oh, please.
So the first day, went to the Amoco building in Chicago, heard this chanting, "Stop big oil, stop big oil." And so I walked through it, and guess who puts a lapel pin on my coat that says "Stop big oil"? And it was Jane Fonda. So I go up the elevator, and the first guy says, "You should take that off here."
Did you get a photo of that?
No.
No. Excellent. Well, you know, she's been active for a long time in this. We're sitting here at Harvard Business School. Let me ask you just an opening question about leadership. As I mentioned, your leadership is viewed as critical, and some even credit you with the survival of BP in those crises from 2010. You also managed the company through the 2014 price plunge. This leadership on your part required fast decisions very quickly, impacting short-term results. Now you're focused, at least in part, on the climate question. How are some of the leadership lessons you learned from your time at BP really translating into an effort to address climate change, which is, of course, a slow, a crisis that is very different than the Deepwater Horizon. It's a slow crisis, but one of significant import.
Well, I think for me, I learned a lot from the Chinese. And then 10 years in Russia, I learned a lot from the Russians. I learned that if you're in China, everyone makes slow moves and no mistakes. And if you're in Russia, you're playing chess, you make 3 moves. The other person will make 3 moves unless you move. So it's at the pace of the game for business is very, very different. And I think that actually helped me a lot through the crisis in the Gulf. Because after my experience in Russia, and I still have good strong feelings about Russia, nothing was going to throw me in the Gulf. I know I wasn't going to get killed. I knew that I had to keep calm, keep everybody calm, because everybody was quite upset, and even keep a little bit of a sense of humor so you don't go crazy. But it was constant daily from government and from everybody. So, and then a management style would be fair, firm, and friendly. Don't play favorites. Fair, firm, and friendly pretty much sums up how I figured out a way to manage. Now, same thing in the climate side, okay? Because there is a little bit of panic about the climate side as well. The pace of it changes. Where you are in the geography, it changes, and the different companies and constituents and employees all have a different reaction to this. So somehow keeping a balance in all that in leadership is really important. And I don't know if I can even use words. I'll use it anyway on stage. Don't bullshit anybody, Be authentic and clear. Don't make stuff up. I used to say, if I don't have the answer, I'm not going to answer. I'll find out. And I think once government and employees see you do that, trust is really important as a leader, I think.
Okay, great.
I think you do this well too, by the way.
No, this is one of the things that I'm constantly telling my students from my time in the White House, that never make anything up. I don't know is an acceptable answer as long as you come back with it later.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we're here at Climate Week, let's delve into your role and the impetus for forming OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. It's unusual to have 12 CEOs of large oil and gas companies that are generally competitors to be collaborating together. Tell us what inspired you to bring that group together and stay dedicated to it now more than 10 years. You've recently noted your 10-year anniversary. And what are the landmark things that you think oil and gas companies can actually contribute to a transition that many would point out seems to be against their core interests?
Yeah, I was supposed to do it for 2 years. It's been 10 now. We're supposed to rotate it, but nobody wanted to take it on, so I keep doing it. So one of the things about I think the oil, I'm going to call it the oil and gas industry. It's really energy industries now because the companies are doing so many other things. But I don't think there's another industry in the world that competes so fiercely with each other and yet collaborates together. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. Not that we just love to collaborate. The size and scale and cross-border nature of the projects, the $50 billion projects, as an example, no one company wants to take all that on for risk. So we compete, and then we jointly develop these giant projects together, okay? And so some of us get along better than others, but that allows engineers and technical people to work together very closely on some amazing engineering feats of man, I think. And so in this case, we got 12 together, wanted to make it not just, it started out with the European oil companies, and then we invited international companies like Aramco, Petrobras, to join, CNPC from China. They're a special case. They are quite a special case because they had to compartmentalize themselves a little bit today. But we started working on not everything. We said we can't do everything on climate change. We're not going to do wind and solar. Some people do wind and solar, some don't. What is the really big things that we need to work on? And it was methane or methane. You know, that, to me, that was the low-hanging fruit and was going to be a place where no one could hide. The technology wasn't there yet, but nobody can hide, I think, from methane leakage today, and really put our money into that. So we formed a $1 billion fund, and people say, well, that's not very much. Where I come from, $1 billion is a lot of money. Doesn't really matter. And so you'd think that would be easy. We just invest and do our calculations or whatever. 12 different methodologies by the companies. It took us 2 years to develop a common language and methodology around methane measurement, how you do it, and at the same time working on some amazing technologies now. We supported some 30 different startups in it. One I really like is a Canadian company called GHGSat, which was up there first, and measuring methane leakage around the world. You know, did we make a difference? Well, we flew over Turkmenistan, and we called them up and said, you have a giant methane leak in Turkmenistan. And we did something similar in Uzbekistan. Now, some of those countries don't like that. The Chinese were one. We said, you have a big leak in China. Take that satellite down. But they didn't. They came around. It was fine. And then we do it for certain individual companies. And then we've worked on infrared goggles, drones, aircraft systems, ground sensors, doing a lot of this in the Permian today. We've got our leakage rates down to 0.2% in methane. These just the OGCI companies. I think the average is 2 or 3 or maybe more in the world. But what we want to do is set an example for everybody. Okay, and so the other thing we've done is we developed what I think is a really precise carbon impact calculation. You can do it on projects, you can do it on companies actually, so that everybody is again using the same language. And you do need a common language in this stuff or it gets very complicated.
So let me kind of advance on that, on this idea of a common language. So you pointed out 12 CEOs, 12 different companies, and unquestionably these companies have different attitudes towards the challenge of climate change. And they see their business model as being more or less compatible with success in that department. So is it more accurate for us to think of this initiative as oil and gas companies that are leaning into making their operations cleaner? And that, I understand that and can see the value in that, and that would not run against a traditional business model for an oil and gas company. Or are they actually dedicated, as much of the literature suggests, to cutting emissions and accelerating the energy transition, which would seem to be against the fundamental business model?
So we started with the European oil companies, the ones that you all know and love, and then got a couple of other international companies, and none of the American companies. So I spent, as did other CEOs, probably 3 or 4 years talking with them, saying, this issue is not going away, and methane is going to be all over the place, and you're going to get caught up on this. You have great technical people. And so one by one, talked with Mike Wirth at Chevron, Vicky Hollab at Occidental, who has an amazing carbon capture program, and then Darren Woods, who I expected would be of Exxon, who I thought would be the last one. And you know, it's a CEO-led organization. We don't have anybody in the room except the CEOs. Now, we had a little bit of a problem there when Exxon said, well, we could get in trouble, antitrust. And I said, you cannot bring your lawyers. So we have an antitrust lawyer in the corner. And it's amazing. They're open, they argue, we debate, we prioritize stuff. And I think it's also fair to say they've all become friends. Mm-hmm. So what used to be when companies had disputes here and there, territorial disputes, like happens in almost any industry, they can cut through it. I love these meetings because after the meeting, which is usually 2 hours every 4 or 5 times a year, then they go off and another half hour solve their own problems. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing, bringing people together.
So is it fair to infer some of these companies may be just interested in decarbonizing their own segment of the industry? Others might be more dedicated, but you're still able to work together even though the long-term vision may be the same, may not be the same?
Well, there's a lot of methane initiatives out there.
Yeah.
So many I can't even name.
We have a big Harvard project on methane.
Yes.
If you're aware.
Maybe you can get a common language among all that stuff. But the purpose of those is, in fact, to share. And all these companies, whether it's Shell or Exxon or BP, whatever, we second people into them, and it's for the greater good. Now, one of the things I'm really proud of, I don't know, I'm probably the only person that's been de-invited from a COP meeting in Britain. So that was COP 26. I was running this little oil company in Britain, and you'd think, I'd be there. I got an official letter from the UN saying, you can't come. Okay, great. So my faith in that sort of went down. But then Sultan and the UAE, first energy producing country, took it on. And we embraced it, OGCI, embraced it heavily. We sent people there. We talked about the kinds of things that could be practically done to reduce emissions.
Yep.
Not just talk and policy, practically. And we all signed up to a charter to reduce our emissions, 11 of the 12. And then Dr. Sultan said, I wanted to expand it. And I was right in the middle of this. I mean, you kind of drove it, actually, working for Adnak. And by the third day, 56 companies signed up to the agreements.
This is at COP28 in Dubai, which was actually, as you pointing out, one of the places where oil and gas companies became part of the COP conversation as well. And
it was practical. I mean, it's practical.
Yeah, and that's
and we're helping the other companies try to get ready for COP 2030. We baseline all the companies now. Some of them didn't even know they had any leakage of methane or methane. Yeah. I mean, it's just starting from scratch. So I see this thing by, 2035 as being an amazing achievement. And I don't see other industries coming out of COP doing this stuff. So I like what we've done, but others need to do it. Steel, aluminum.
Switch. Yeah, there's real potential for more of that. I've never been uninvited from COP, but at the beginning of my career, I did get a letter from the US government inviting me not to pay taxes next year if I had not made more money, not to file taxes unless I made more money than I had the previous year. So that was like one for the files. Let's talk about BP. particularly, and BP and its trajectory as being an energy company versus an oil and gas company. And as many people in this audience will be well aware, there has been the multiple occasions where BP has leaned in to renewables and investments in renewables and then had to recalibrate, makes targets and then recalibrate. There was earlier in your career at BP, I mentioned that you led the renewables under John Brown, and then that BP pulled back under your leadership. BP leaned forward again, and then very recently has had to pull back. Can you give us your perspective on how you think that affects the relationship between oil and gas companies and society, and in terms of like the commitment of companies to, I think as someone, perhaps you has said, transform and perform at the same time? What's the essential challenge of doing that? Is it actually possible for oil companies to meet these targets and still meet the needs and desires of their shareholders?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very complicated question. I mean, for a while, BP was called just big problems. I mean, it just had problem after problem. Merged with Amoco for a brief time, was the largest oil and gas company in the world. Mm-hmm. And most people wouldn't know that at that time, it was the third largest solar company in the world, because of Amoco and BP, behind a couple of Japanese firms, all of which are basically gone. I mean, to be honest, China commoditized, just overbuilt all of the panels, and it became completely uneconomic to do that. And that's one of the things when you're running a business, you can keep running and hitting the wall and things, but when things aren't going to make sense economically, you have to change directions here. And of course, BP has had a number of those, including the spill in the Gulf and some things that has made it have to pull back. I've seen all the different products, lines of business, trading, retailing, they go through these cycles. Chemicals is a really big cycle, by the way. And at some point, you just have to pull back. You've got to perform for your shareholders. And what happened with BP, I would say, in the 90s or the 2000s, I mean, it was the worst performing big company. And you get to a point where you just better change or you'll be gone. Okay, so what is the trade-off? Is it people are disappointed that you're pulling back from certain businesses, wind and solar, when they're not making any money, and the hardest job in a big oil and gas company, I guess it is in many other companies, is how you allocate your capital. Because if you don't allocate your capital right, you're going to allocate yourself right out of business. So is it about trust? Don't know. I mean, I've always been a big believer in natural gas as going to be essential for the future. And I didn't realize how much until I started spending time with Microsoft and Google. Mm-hmm. And I thought that natural gas was just going to bump coal out of the U.S. and then natural gas would go away. But I don't know if you've seen the projections needed for the data centers, not just in the U.S., globally. You can't do it with wind and solar. And I wish you could, but there's just not going to be enough to fill the demand of AI on large scales.
So I think your answer raises a question that's out there about the need for policy in moving businesses in the direction of action that helps address climate change. And we're at a particular moment where I think it's very poignant. So where we feel the pullback from ambitious climate change agendas. So we see that in policy here in the United States, in other parts of the world as energy security becomes front and center more. And of course, we've seen in the absence of policy, a lot of companies that had been dedicated to certain targets remove themselves from those targets and withdraw themselves from various financing initiatives for the very reasons that you point out. So could you tell us what you think is required from the world of policy in order to kind of smooth that out? So is it possible for the world to move ahead in the direction of the energy transition without aggressive policy frameworks? Or is that the only way that we're going to be able to get all actors in society to move in one direction?
Yeah, I think there's probably two areas here. So one would be what OGCI is doing, where it closed out its first billion-dollar fund with 30 relatively early life cycle companies. We've now closed a $600 million fund for later in time, and then we're doing another $400 million one with ADNOC, in fact. Thank you, by the way, to invest in technologies. Because I think technology, we don't know. I mean, who knew this was going to be such a big thing 20 years ago? We don't know what's going to happen. You know, small nuclear reactors could be involved. There's all kinds of technologies that will happen. So one is the market can work. It takes a group of relatively well-capitalized companies to do it. The smaller companies are going to have a hard time doing it. Yep. So big companies doing like what we're doing. But the other thing is everybody hates regulation. I think regulation is key to this. I mean, I think we must have regulation with teeth on leaking methane or methane. I mean, and you should find companies for it, because the technology is now there. They have to invest some money in it. But boy, certain countries should do this. The United States should do it. Permitting is a different matter. I think there's a crisis in permitting, because permitting is national, it's state, it's local. It's really hard to get stuff done in certain places. So but regulation on fining people for clear things, I'm a big fan of.
Great. So I'd like to shift a little bit to geopolitics, something that you and I love to talk about, and you're spending a lot of your time now engaged in many areas around the world. And one of those is you sit as a director on the board of Aramco, the Saudi oil company, energy company. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about Saudi oil policy and decision-making right now. So we see what everyone is interpreting as a shift in the Saudi policy of kind of really trying to keep up the price in order to maximize the revenues. We now see OPEC and Saudi Arabia putting more oil back on the market, kind of lessening the cuts that have been in place for so long. A little bit perplexing in what's perceived to be a weak oil market. So is this a shift in strategy on the part of the Saudis to a more market share strategy, what they're getting ready to try to prepare for a world in which oil companies are fighting for smaller markets? This, however, doesn't seem consistent with the fact that, you know, peak oil demand doesn't seem to be as close on the horizon as many people thought just a few years ago. So can you, I know that as a director, it's hard to ask you for deep secrets, but certainly you can help us understand what from afar looks like it might be a more political decision than some would have us think.
Yeah, Saudi Aramco, it's this little company that has $21 trillion of revenue a year. And of course, it is the big gorilla.
I think your definition of little is open to question here.
And it's the great gorilla in the oil markets. And for many years is the stabilizer in the oil markets to prevent them from going up or down too much. Now, they've made a couple of mistakes where they plunged it, I think. But their basic role is to say, they probably have a technical team as many as people are in this room, calculating what is happening around the world with oil and product movements. I mean, they're amazing. There is something going on here. So, same thing happened in the last administration, by the way, the Biden administration. Wanted oil prices kind of down during the midterms. I'm thinking something like that is going on in terms of a discussion between the US and the Saudis, because it makes no sense for the Saudis to be putting more oil on the markets, or the Russians, which are putting more oil on the markets, unless they want to bring the prices down to a degree. And I think it has something to do with security agreements in the Middle East. And that's probably about all I can say. I think
Okay.
it's just more complicated than just the markets, I think.
So I know there are many people in this room who follow this closely, but the great thing about being a professor is you can say things that you can't say when you're directors of companies and things, but it's a very interesting set of priorities that the Saudis and others have to navigate. Their relationship with the Trump administration, their desire to secure a defense agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, an unprecedented agreement, and their desire to maintain revenues. These three things are a hard triangle to balance. So it's fascinating to watch and really consequential for a lot of things we've been talking about. So staying on the geopolitics, we're in a world, and we've talked about this over the week here at Harvard, we're in a world where geopolitics are kind of roaring back onto the stage, and energy security is no longer kind of a conversation of the past, it's a conversation of the present. And in some ways, it can squeeze out other priorities, or it's at least competing with other priorities. And that's in combination with changes in the energy industry, maybe even in the US shale industry, if we see kind of a slowing of that revolution, that maybe is going to create circumstances where energy could be more weaponized. It could be used more as a tool of foreign policy or national security. We've seen that with Russia, which you know well. Do you think that is that in your forecast of the future? Do you think that energy is going to be used for political purposes more than it has in the previous 3 decades?
Yeah, I think it is being used. And your point about the Permian is also interesting, because if oil prices, this is where the Saudis, it's also complicated.
Yeah.
If the oil price does come down, some of the first production in the world to be shut in is the Permian. So that's not really why they're doing it, but that'll also balance.
This is the dilemma for the Trump administration. They want low oil prices and high American production. These two things are in tension with each other.
And then I see some things happening, I don't know, weaponizing it or whatever, but I think the U.S. has made an incredible mistake by upping the tariffs in India to 50%.
On India.
On India. And pushing new spheres of countries together. You could say that the Saudis made a mistake because they wouldn't give the Indians a little bit of a discount, so the Indians went and got a bigger discount with the Russians. That's obviously what's happened.
Right.
But that's not helping the world, I think.
So on this point, given your long history with Russia, let me ask you about the vulnerability of that industry to sanctions. So one of the things that obviously have been talked about for some time, and the Europeans have imposed even more sanctions, speculation about whether the Trump administration will. How vulnerable do you think the Russian oil industry will be, or the Russian economy, which is kind of synonymous with its energy industry, will be to the kinds of sanctions that are being discussed?
Well, there were pretty heavy sanctions put on Russia. The actual result and impact was much lower than people expected. I think the GDP, dropped 4%. People were thinking 14 to 20. There's the two places in the world to produce oil at the cheapest. I don't know about Abu Dhabi. I don't know about Abu Dhabi, but certainly Saudi Arabia has the lowest what they call lifting costs, and second is Russia at $4 or $5 a barrel. They can produce oil at $4 or $5 a barrel. So it just comes out of the ground. It gets around. They do it through trucks in certain countries and ships, and there's a lot of people probably cheating on the shipping. Why? But when the U.S. set the sanctions, they said Russia could sell as much oil as it wanted at $50 a barrel when the price was 65. So that was going to be a big hit. It wasn't that meaningful. Now, I don't know what they're going to do with new sanctions. I don't really know. It's got to involve shipping, though. I mean, it's got to get a bigger group of people to be involved in it. And whatever you think, Vladimir Putin is a very popular leader. Okay, don't underestimate the fact that he is very popular in his country. They love strong leaders. He compartmentalizes control the way he does. But I read here that, you know, any day now there's going to be a coup and he's going to fall over. I don't think so. Some of you may think so. What do you think?
I think that is not the scenario I'd bet on. And I actually think that there is a willingness on the part of many Russians, whether or not they support Vladimir Putin and whether or not they're getting accurate information about what Russia's doing in the world, I think is an open question. But I think there is a willingness and an ability to endure more pain than might be the case in other countries. And so that does make sanctions a harder tool to use. You know, I would like to open to questions here to get a few questions in from the audience. And we've got one question here, which I will read out. To what extent can market forces and investor pressure keep momentum on climate action even when a particular country's policies retreat? So we didn't talk that much about investor pressure. You mentioned investors, you know, wanting returns, but then there are some investor sentiments wanting climate action. So I think this is a little bit more on the balance there.
This is a hard one, and it's not going to be static, okay? I think, you know, as climate events begin to happen more and more and more, we'll see the pendulum swing back a little bit, because the pendulum swung too far this way. And I think as we watch things, it'll swing back the other way. I'm an optimist about that. It's not for me to give Europe any advice, but I will, if that's okay with you.
Why not?
So I don't know if any of you have heard of something called CSDDD. So it's an industrial policy that was put into law by the commissioners on a Friday night without much consultation, and it will charge companies who violate their promises on emissions and any human rights issues. They can be fined 5% of their global revenues, not even profits, not European revenues. Now, I'll just give you a great example of Saudi Aramco with $21 trillion of revenue and has one operation in Poland. It's gone. Exxon's announced it's leaving Europe. There are people that are just said, we can't do business this way. The risks are way too high. So there's some disconnect in Europe that maybe some of you can fix. I don't know. And they've got some other policies. They're great climate policies, but I mean, to be honest, Royal Dutch Shell moved to the UK. So I worry about that, and I see their industrial policy with the Chinese, with electric vehicles. The chemical industry globally is in terrible, terrible shape. So I kind of worry about Europe myself. The US is a strong economy. It's got its ups and downs, good points, bad points. Chinese seem to be doing fine. But somehow there has to be some rationale in industrial policy.
Yeah. And this, I think this question was also referring to investor pressure. Do you see investor pressure from multiple perspectives, meaning to go faster on the energy transition and to go slower? Like, to what extent does investor pressure factor into companies or even, you know, the work of OGCI?
Yeah. OGCI seems to have a lot of support for everything we're doing because they're really investing it. But BP is a great example. Lots and lots of investor pressure to go back to doing wind and solar. And then Elliott comes in and wants everything gone, including the management, unless they get back to what they call their knitting. And inside the companies, you have this. And you've seen it at BHP before. So these activists have the ability to do things economically that are, personally, I'm going to offend somebody here. This is, to me, the worst part of American capitalism. These people that come in and just rip companies off, tear them apart for short-term gains. So you have lots of pressures.
You're talking about activist in the investor sense, not in the climate sense. Just in this context, I wanted to make sure that everyone understood your comments.
Yeah, that's right. And there is pressure. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on BP in the climate side as well. So you've got both of these things inside companies right now.
Yeah.
So I think investors, I mean, I have no idea why BlackRock and everybody and ESG has suddenly all disappeared, but you clearly have government policy that's not helping this.
Right. I think going back to our exchange about the importance of government policy. And let's see if there is another question here. Okay. This gets us back to the Middle East. The Middle East has arguably been more unsettled at any time than in decades, yet the price of oil has been surprisingly low. Do you think this signals a disconnect between geopolitics and energy markets? It is true. We've looked at a very, very complex geopolitical picture in the Middle East. And, if you had told me that Israel and the United States would attack Iran and the price of oil would be lower in the subsequent weeks, I would have not believed it.
That's right. That says something about the balance in the markets. So today, I think Brent crude is probably got to be close to $65 a barrel. You talk to India, that's not low price. I mean, there's a lot of countries around the world that are very, very stressed at these oil prices and would love to see them 50 and 40. The Saudis have managed to kind of work among the other OPEC countries and OPEC plus countries without a lot of friction, I think. Stock levels are not so high around the world. I mean, it's kind of all in a little bit of a balance. But it's probably no surprise to you, and I guess I can tell you this, but I'm on the committee, Risk and Safety. The greatest enterprise-wide risk for Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco, is closure of the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb, which closes off the Red Sea. The amount of time and effort on probabilities and thinking about all that, anything can happen in these markets still.
Which is, I think, the essence of this question is how strange it is that you could have such turmoil and cross-border military action that doesn't seem to affect the price of oil. So, perhaps there is no specific answer to that, but or perhaps it lies in China and Chinese demand and the Chinese economy. And
I think that is the big variable, China.
Big variable. So let's see if there is another question. Oh, okay. I have one last question. I think we have time for one last question in closing. And I want to take you back to sort of the 2006 era. So this was before we understood what the American shale revolution was going to look like. And there was this perception that companies, not perception, reality, companies were having to go into more and more high-risk areas in order to produce and bolster their reserves. And then there was nervousness about, obviously, the climate trajectory. And you had an opportunity for an odd coalition of environmentalist advocates and people really concerned about energy security to come together and actually get behind policies that related to efficiency and related to, trying to manage the growth in oil demand and all of these things. You had national security hawks concerned with energy security and America's dependence on Iran and all these other places. And you had environmentalists, and then you had CEOs who, thought that trying to look for oil in Chad, wasn't their desired, political risk management strategy. Do we have a moment like that now where there's a potential for cross collaboration, environmentalists, people in the corporate world, and national security people who look at this moment and say we should all be united in certain kinds of pursuits that help energy security and climate?
Megan, I certainly think that 2006 in that era was a lost opportunity. Yeah. And I think it was about just very strong, different divided views in the US that were preventing it from coming together on some of these things. Is this the right moment? They sure feel divided again. Yeah. So I'm hopeful. Everybody, including the oil and gas and energy companies, are working on all of these things. They all know that technology is going to be the solution here. They just all know it because they're technical people. And if you can get good regulation, get the technology going, get some people that don't want to hold on to the technology and want to share it, and that's what I like about OGCI, because we will share. I'm optimistic. What could go wrong with this is almost three, four spheres of influence, all acting a little bit differently now. You got the United States, you have China now lining itself up with India. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's not great, and Russia. And you've got Europe. So you'll never have a global carbon price, I don't think. I like carbon pricing, but when you get into the details of carbon pricing, you find out it becomes, if there's a global price, it's a currency, okay? And regions of the world won't like that. But you can get regional carbon prices. Europe has actually a pretty good one. So it's going to take a while. There's no silver bullets here. I don't know, maybe AI could be the silver bullet that I don't understand, but you all do. I don't know. I mean, with AI, I do know one thing: energy efficiency could easily come down 20%, because AI can make energy move different, your home, other things. So that'll come along.
Well, I appreciate you ending on an optimistic note. I do think there are many ways in which AI could help us with the energy transition. I'd like to just conclude by thanking you for your decades of leadership and for your continued efforts to work on these difficult issues of geopolitics, of the energy transition and climate change. Please join me in thanking Bob for being with us here today.
Thank you all. The next session, Rising Seas, Resilient Communities, Climate Adaptation Strategies in West Africa, will begin after the break.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, I can hear me coming out in the control room behind me. That's just not going out, correct? Hello. All right, so I don't think I can hear you.
Hello.
Oh, perfect. I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you.
So we are going to do a quick test of audio from our end, just to make sure you can hear us. And then we should be all set, ready to go after the break.
Okay, thank you very much. After the break. Okay. Okay.
You got that okay?
Count, go, wall to rising seas, and VOG, go.
Please welcome our moderator, Emmanuel A. Champon, Ellen Gurney, Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Adeto Kunbo Wahab, Commissioner for Environment and Water Resources, Lagos State, Nigeria. And joining by Zoom, Georges Quadiayo, Professor, Technical Advisor in charge of National Environmental Policy Programs and Projects, Ministry of Environment, Sustainable Development and Ecological Transition, Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. And Nana Amakluche, Acting CEO, Ghana Environmental Agency.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Emmanuel Champon, and I have the pleasure of leading one of the Salata climate clusters on climate adaptation in the Gulf of Guinea. So we are now pivoting towards West Africa. We're going in a different direction where the emphasis and the focus is on climate adaptation more than climate mitigation. If you walked through the hallway and you saw the photography exhibition, communities caught in the midst of coastal erosion and flooding. We are wrestling with finance and climate finance, what will come from the international community, what governments can do for themselves, what local communities can do for themselves. We're trying to ground policy in climate science and good solid knowledge, physical science, social science, humanity. So we're going to a different part of the world. And it is my pleasure to have as my panelists, and they were already introduced, so I'll introduce them very briefly. To my left is Professor Nana Amakluche, who is the head of EPA in Ghana. Before that was the head of the Department of Physics at the University of Ghana. So by training, she's an atmospheric physicist. And she is the vice chair of one of the IPCC panels. So very distinguished scientist. To her left is Honorable Tukumbo Wahab, who is the Commissioner for the Environment and Water Resources, Lagos State. Commissioner Wahab is trained as a lawyer, is an alumnus of the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Business School, and the Wharton School of Business. So, and then on screen we have Professor Georges Quadiayo, who is a professor of atmospheric chemistry. But he is also the Chief Technical Officer to the Minister for the Environment, Sustainable Development, and Ecological Transition in the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. So three wonderful panelists for the Gulf of Guinea, for the countries that we work in. I wanted us to observe a moment of silence. We were supposed to have a panelist who was the Honorable Minister for Environment from Ghana, Ibrahim Mutala Mohammed. And there was a military helicopter crash in Ghana early last month, and unfortunately he was on it with other government ministers and party officials, and we lost them all. So a moment's silence for the late Minister Mohammed, and then we will continue. Okay. So let me provide a little context, and then we will start our conversation. So the Gulf of Guinea, the countries share certain geographical features. The southern border is the Atlantic Ocean. But they also have this barrier lagoon system that extends all the way from Côte d'Ivoire to Lagos. So our coastal communities are literally sandwiched between the Atlantic Ocean and the lagoon. And in this context of climate change and extreme weather, sometimes the assault is from both directions. Gulf of Guinea is subject to pernicious coastal erosion, and you've seen that in the photo exhibition. But the countries also have very unique challenges. So let me name one for each country, and then we open up to our conversation. So if I take Lagos, 40% of Lagos's landmass is covered by either bodies of water, wetlands, or floodplains. Lagos itself sits on a continental shelf that is sinking. And scientists tell us, and I don't like that prediction, that come 2050, maybe Lagos as we know it may not exist. Yet, 10% of the entire population of Nigeria lives in Lagos. I mean, something's got to give. So that's Lagos. When I go to Ghana, I'm always happy to say Ghanaians are Pan-African fishermen. I find them in Ghana town from the Gambia all the way to Cameroon. We are so good at sea fishing, we have overfished our waters to the point that fishing stocks have declined. And scientists worry whether they can be even a sustainable recovery. So also another area of urgent action. Côte d'Ivoire, you love chocolate, right? Côte d'Ivoire produces 40% of the world's chocolate. But this success has come at the cost of its forests. And since independence, much of Côte d'Ivoire's forest cover is gone. In this context of climate change, you need your trees. So it's actively looking at reforestation. And then there are also external measures that have added additional pressure, like the recent European Union deforestation regulation, which seeks to penalize cocoa coming from areas or countries with deforestation. So each country also has their own unique challenges. So the first question I put to our panelists is looking at this sort of clash between climate change and population growth. So let me give you what the population for our three major cities were in 1950 and in 2025, and then you get a sense. So Abidjan, which is in Côte d'Ivoire, increased from 65,000 in 1950 to 6.1 million in 2025. Accra went from 177,000 in 1950 to almost 3 million in 2025. Lagos is a mega city. Lagos went from 325,000 in 1950, and there's dispute about Lagos's population now. But a conservative estimate in 2025 is 17.2 million. But the numbers are often even cited that are higher. So let me turn to our panelists and ask how their countries, their ministries or agencies are responding to this collision between population growth and climate change, and then we'll go from there. So why don't we start with Honorable Wahab?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. For Lagos, let me start by putting it in a context. Lagos sits on the continental shelves, like you said, and Lagos is bounded on the south by about 186 kilometers of the Atlantic. In 1950, 300,000 plus. In 2025, it's about 22, 23 million people. A third of Lagos is water. We know that. And Lagos is a sub-national, unlike Ghana, unlike Côte d'Ivoire. in all this, when you have this population explosion, there's a demand for housing, there's a demand for other infrastructures, which means the numbers we've seen from our EGIS showing that the land mass of Lagos, which originally was 3,577 square kilometers, had increased to 4,050 square kilometers, shows a massive reclamation. Reclamation of wetlands, reclamation of lagoon water body for real estate construction. As a ministry, the law gave us the right to also put these activities by humans in check. And how do we do that? We insist, for instance, that you must obtain your environmental impact assessments before you do any form of reclamation because of the implication on the ecosystem. That you must have a drainage master plan to show us how you want to discharge the storm water from that reclamation into the water body. Now, when you have a population of about 22, 23 million, you also have to factor in the waste generated. A day, Lagos generates 13,000 tons of metric waste a day, which is a challenge on its own. This is a state that has been used to the linear waste collection system. You pick, you dump. Landfills are already being decommissioned. And what we have to do is look inwards, find a very sustainable, climate-friendly approach, which now tends to see waste as a resource. Resource for wealth, resource for energy, and we are approaching that now aggressively. So that the quantum of waste that ends up in our landfills become very minimal, whilst we convert our waste into a better resource. So let me wrap this up by saying that we're not seeing our population as a challenge, but we believe if we don't check the human activities, because as a state, we have our own existential kind of challenge. Climate change is real to us. We have sea level rise every year between March and October. The rain is excessive. The flash flooding is real because when you marry sea level rise with excessive rainfall and there's a tidal lock, storm water will not discharge, and then you have excessive heat. What we can't allow come at us is when you have the human elements of people greedily and wantonly destroying the ecosystem, taking out the preserved mangrove that protects us, taking out wetlands to build real estate without proper consideration for the environment, then you have a recipe for future crisis.
Thank you. Let me turn to Professor Kluchi.
Yes. Yeah, so thank you, and thanks for having me here as well. In the case of Ghana, probably let me pick it from Africa in general. Discussing reducing population in Africa is a difficult discussion to have. We all know this. Because once someone or anybody feels, a family feels they can take care of children, they go the route of how many children they want to have. But you also know, as the Honorable Minister said, the Commissioner said, this population also is impacting on our ecosystem, on our land resources and every other resources as well. Picking from also the topic on the rising seas, we see the impact of the population on climate change that's adding to the global warming effect, because in Africa we have land use change because of developing, because of population growth. So there's the taste, and also economic growth. So there's a taste for expansion of building and spaces where people live, and also economic activities. These impact on global warming, and that also affects the melting of the ice in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, where we don't see in Africa. What we get is a sea level rise, because when these ice melts, they melt into the ocean, and the consequences we feel in Africa because we feel the sea level rise, which is eating up our coasts. So we get coastal erosion, and the land in our coastal areas are taken over by the sea. And so communities living along the oceans or along the beaches have to move inland. And that is also affecting or creating more spaces in areas where we have forests. And so it means that we are clearing forest areas, we are using up our wetlands, as the Honorable Commissioner said. We have similar challenge in Ghana where real estate is taking over our wetland areas. As Environmental Protection Authority, we have to protect these ecosystem spaces. But it becomes very difficult when it becomes widespread. And you see many groups and persons are taking over these wetland areas. Difficult to regulate that. It's a big challenge for us. Whilst we are educating the importance of these wetland spaces as part of our ecosystem, where we get our runoff there, where we get some specific species of plant and animals that forms part of our ecosystem. Others do not understand. Even the education or educated population still go that route of taking up the wetland spaces. I want us to look at it in a holistic point of view. Whilst African communities are vulnerable to climate change and suffering the impact much more than, I would say, the developed world because we have low adaptive capacity, we have to look at it as every activity, every action in developing country in Africa affect also the global community. Because once we've taken up our forests down for spaces because of increased population, this is affecting the global warming, melting the ice caps and getting back into the ocean. So we're losing land, we're using forest, we are growing the population. And there are many activities that we do, especially if developed countries do not have much issue with land use change. But developing countries, we have big issues with land use change. And that has huge impact on our climate system. And so we have to look at things holistically. Whilst we're growing our population in Africa, if there could be measures in place for Africans to understand that we have to reduce our population, I'll be very happy. But this, as I said earlier on, is a very difficult discussion to have in Africa. Even in Ghana, we have over 80 adult literates, 80% literacy in Ghana. But it doesn't, sit down well to talk about reducing population or reducing family size. And so these may be basic discussions, but it affects the global community, affects the economic situation of the country that we already know. So we need to guide ourselves in implementing the policies that we have signed up to locally and also internationally. Most African countries have signed up to the Paris Agreement and so many other global policies. Following that, we need to do that in a context of our capacity. So while a country may want to present their nationally determined contribution towing a particular line, it may not be the same for another country. So that's why each country is developing their own nationally determined contribution per their capacities. So for Ghana, we have an ambitious nationally determined contribution anyway, which we are doing slowly, but the financial implications is also huge, and government alone cannot support the plan that we have in our nationally determined contribution, which means that we are open for support, for global support, for private sector investment in everything that we do. One area we are looking at, which was discussed in the morning, is in the carbon market. So whilst we are educating and advocating for our forests to be kept preserved, in some of our forests to be preserved, we also need to tap into the new direction on climate financing, where we can use the carbon credits to support vulnerable groups. So in Ghana, for instance, we have programs like renewable energy solutions, clean cooking stoves for vulnerable communities and some, I would say, poor communities, if I may put it that way. We have introduced electric vehicles also in Ghana. We have electric motorbikes and so many other interventions. We are encouraging the use of other renewable energy, solar panels, wind energy, and all of that. Looking also at the potential Ghana has in renewable energy. We have very long sunshine hours in all year round, and so that's a resource we can tap into. What we don't have is the human or expertise, the technology, which we can also collaborate with countries like China, like USA, like European countries to come in with the technology whilst we have the resources available. And we work together for the solutions that we have for the globe. Because as I said, we have to look at things holistically. I mentioned earlier on, whilst our population growth, changing land use is affecting the global climate, whatever others are doing in their countries equally affects the climate system. So we have to look at things holistically.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll go to Professor Kwajo on screen. If you can share what is happening in terms of this tension or collision between population growth and climate change from Côte d'Ivoire, and also from the perspective of Abidjan. I think you have muted yourself.
Thank you very much,
okay,
everybody. I apologize to not be with you at this precious moment to discuss about the population and the climate change. Concerning Côte d'Ivoire, I have two pictures in my hand, in my mind. When I was young, they told me that Côte d'Ivoire is a good economical situation for everybody. During the period of 1563 to 1580. In this period, we are space to education, health, infrastructure, and the population grow, and the economical condition seem better. But we don't take into account the environmental safeguard, and they don't take into account the social condition of the people. And we grow with an economical model that we use according to the condition of development of big countries. And for Africa, we follow the road of this development. And after about 50 years, we are faced to another challenge, named climate change. For the key indicator in Côte d'Ivoire is deforestation. The population grow and the deforestation grow also. And according to the talk of the two others, we can say that the big challenge is to change the model of development, to bring solution to our communities. First, if you consider deforestation, the government took an act to prepare the community to change their manner to make agriculture and to talk with the private sector to be involved on the ENDC progress. And for that, they use a partnership concerning the forest in order to make agroforestry, in order to share a contract that it is a win-win contract in order to cover our forest, our land by forest, about 20% until 2030 in order to recover our land with forests. It is the first challenge. And the second is concern coastal erosion. And for that, we need to change the mentality of the people who live in the coastal area. It is very important because there are a destruction of mangrove, and the mangrove, it is very important to stabilize the coastal. And for that, we built the project like WACA, like FOLAB, like PRAY, in order to give the population the occasion to restore the coastal area with mangrove plants. And there is another challenge is about pollution in general. And for pollutions, we took two acts. One, we changed our environmental law, and we take another law concerning climate change in order to reinforce the state governance. And for that, we build a committee we supervised by the Prime Minister in order to engage all the stakeholders to fight against climate change. I will stop there, but in the vision of the government of Côte d'Ivoire, we have to integrate in our strategy, in our national plan of development, all the questions of climate change, of biodiversity, of desertification, in order to have the same vision to fight against the three crises, the three environmental crises. Thank you very much for this first question.
Thank you, Professor George. Your reference to WACA, and I'll come to that. Professor Kluche.
Emmanuel?
Yes.
Do you listen to me?
No, now I am speaking more to I'm setting up the context for the second question. So the second question is coming soon. Okay. So your comments underscored the fact that it's one world. Yep. Developments in the developed world affect us. Things that we do in our world also affects the developed world. And I remember in January 2023, I went to Kinshasa, DRC, for the first time. And then my host told me the day before I left, oh, we forgot to do one thing. And I said, what? He said there's only one main road entering the city of Kinshasa. He says, we should have gone to sit by the road and count the number of trucks coming into the city with bags of charcoal. And I said, okay. He says, the world likes to believe that the forest in DRC is being conserved as a carbon sink lungs for them. But that the greatest threat to the forest in DRC is the absence of rural electrification. And the trees are being cut and being converted into charcoal. And it stayed with me, just as you are pointing to the impact of things that are happening in Ghana. So we are signatories to global climate conventions. But let's talk about the regional and the local. Are there initiatives regionally? Professor George talked about WACA, which is the World Bank-funded West African Coastal Areas Management Program. So it's to coordinate along the coast. We have ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. So are there initiatives regionally? And are your individual countries also coordinating with neighbors. Because when it comes to things like coastal protection and stabilization, you tinker with your coast, and then something happens in the next country. And I mean, if you take Togo, the coastline of all of Togo is 42 miles.
Yep.
That is all. So neighbors and what they do can have profound implications on Togo. So if we can speak now to regional initiatives, to what you do with your neighbors in areas like coastal protection and stabilization. So, Commissioner Wahab.
Thank you very much, Prof. Now, for us as a sub-national, you have to put that in a context. Lagos is a sub-national in Nigeria, and yeah, maybe the most prosperous of all the states in the country. And if we are to be a country, we'll be the fourth largest economy in the sub-Saharan Africa. So for Lagos, what we can do is limited to what the national government seeks to do.
Yes.
But thankfully, there have been collaborations on the Gulf of Guinea between the government of Nigeria and neighboring governments. But as a state, what we had also done is set up policies, set up laws and regulations that enables us as a sub-national to reach out to neighboring countries where they have expertise and they've had a proven track record for what we seek to do. And I'll give a practical example. 18 months ago, we reached out to Accra, and we found out there is a company in Ghana that had handled the municipal solid waste for a while, and they've done it successfully, even in the sub-region. And we reached out to the company. We had conversations, and today we have had a constitutional agreement signed with them. And what they have to do is help take 4,000 over 13,000 municipal solid waste, convert to wells, compost fertilizers, recyclable plastics, and then set up a transfer station for most of the strategic part of the state. If that is done in the next 18 months, we seek to decommission one of the most notorious landfills that have been in the heart of Lagos, Olushosu and Solo Street. That is a progressive way of doing collaboration at a sub-national, and that's what we're seeking to do in the past few years. We've also, at a sub-national, set up a climate adaptation plan, and then we have our climate adaptation and resilience plan also. This encapsulates our vision, our policies, to say, okay, we have done a pre-feasibility with respect to some areas that we need support. If support is going to come, we want it in the waste, municipal solid waste to energy or waste to wealth, or liquid waste platform. And it's stimulated a lot of interest from the sub-region of Africa. So these are the limitations we have at the sub-national. Unlike maybe Ghana as a national can reach out to African Development Bank or AfriExim for support. But for a sub-national, we have to go to the national government to assess some of these things. Thank you.
Indeed, indeed. Professor Kluchi.
Yes, thank you. So I think ECOWAS has a climate change program, and they're doing a lot in the sub-region. So one of what they do is they were in Ghana last week, where I had to go and open a program on behalf of my late minister on providing guidance to the sub-region on the carbon market and carbon trading. And so in the sub-region, a number of activities are going on. I know also that there are a lot of work on adaptation and mitigation plan. And then they do have training for negotiators, the COPs, the UNFCCC programs and activities. Quite apart from that, Ghana has also served as a leader in most of these activities. Ghana transferred its first ITMO to Switzerland on a carbon market. So we did a carbon trading with Switzerland government. So that's the first of its kind in Africa and the largest actually in the world transfer of carbon trading. So we've got countries coming to learn how we went about it in Ghana and all of that. So we provide such support for the neighboring countries. Probably the whole of the sub-Saharan African, because we've had visits from Rwanda, we have visitors from Liberia and other countries. one thing I want to mention is that following this topic, especially on adaptation strategies, we need to be informed on what we need to put our adaptation plans on. I served as a vice chair for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 1. Before then, I worked as a lead author in the State Assessment Report. My experience is that these reports inform most of the global decisions that translate at the national level in most of the activities that we do on climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. I see the voice from our side of the world being low, voice not just talking on the table like this, but also in the writing of the report. And so whilst we planning or asking for support and also implementing the global policies, we need to also be part of the decision. We need to be providing the information that we have in our regions that will inform the report, that will eventually inform the policies that come up for us to sign up to. And so these supports, of course, most countries may not be able to do it on their own, because earlier we had a conversation before the room, that what can we do also for ourselves? For me, the list is, let's publish what we have, the knowledge that we have. And whenever we have support from outside, it should not be a cut and paste of either technology or idea that has worked in some other countries on us. We have our peculiar situations, we have our peculiar challenges, and so it demands very specific solutions. So I believe in co-defining the problems and co-creating the solutions as well. So we may have to do some adjustment in some solutions that we get. Otherwise, we get solutions that are not also usable. 2 years ago, I was on European Union Parliament panel, and I was posed the question that clean cooking stoves were shared to some communities in Africa. They were happy with the packaging and they rushed for it, but after a couple of months later, they stopped using it, and they wanted to understand why. Is it because people still want to use firewood and charcoal storage that you mentioned in Kinshasa, or what is really the problem? So when I see that though we have a beautiful technology to use, we need to embed our culture also into it, the social and cultural settings into it. Because using a different technology or a new technology, which has not been part of the people, will need a lot of education and a lot of showcasing before it will eventually materialize. And so implementing policies, same as introducing new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm smiling because I was reminded, I've often been told that fish smoked on wood from mangroves tastes better. So that's why. Professor George, you have muted. If you can unmute yourself again.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. I think if you are faced of climate change, you have to keep in your mind you don't have a national solution. Because if you do that, you know, the atmosphere, the oceans have no boundaries. And you have to have local action. Whereas, you know, there is a convention, general convention, and you put it in at the regional level, and you have to take into account the issue, the common issue in the regional level. For that, you remember that African Minister of Environment created about 50 years ago the AMSEN to discuss about this question. And now, if you do things alone, you don't go very far. And it is important to collaborate. I can give some example. I give the example of Waka for coastal erosion. You know, because of the circulation, some countries want to build a protection, but that modify the circulation of the Gulf of Guinea, and we have a return action. And for the model, for the regional model, you can fight very strongly against this coastal erosion. It is very important to share this picture, to be together with ECOWAS, to share our experience in order to fight very efficiently against this question of climate change. You know, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, for example, their economy is based on cocoa. And when you discuss at international level, if you go individually to make negotiations, it is not good for us. You have to be together because we have the same base of our economical situation. And for that, we create an initiative named ECF, Initiative for Cacao and Forest. And we share our experience. You have a same action plan, and we put it at national level with specific action. But in our mind, we have the same questions, and we have the same solution, and to implement in our national level. Another example is the question of what name in English? Small mining.
Small scale mining.
Well, small scale mining. You know, when I was General Director of Environment, you know, the river in the south part of Cote d'Ivoire, with the boundary of Ghana, you use the Sam River. And one Sunday, the two ministers come to discuss because the questions of river pollution that the chair is very, very, very critical. Without this approach, I can say that you are going to fall together. And it is very important to collaborate with ECOWAS to have the same regulations, and we can implement this action in our individual country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see that my clock says 2.34. Does it mean we have only 2 minutes and 34 seconds left? May I take a question or two? We got carried away. Any questions from the audience?
No, there's a question on the screen.
Sorry?
There's a question on the screen.
Okay, there's a question there, and I saw a hand also there. And I think we just speak out. We don't take a mic to them or anything. Okay, if you can please maybe just say your name and speak loudly. And
Prof, there's a question already here for Lagos.
There's a question on the teleprompter. Okay, so do I go there first?
Okay.
It says in the last few days, Lagos has been under flood water. This is a perennial problem. It has been raining for several days. Can the Commissioner for the Environment for Lagos State speak to the factors that explain flooding in the city? How has climate change affected the situation? How is the Lagos State government responding? This is a big question.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me be very prompt on this. Now, for us as a coastal state, I made it clear that we are exposed to the vagaries of climate change, sea level rise, excessive rainfall, and excessive heat. So when you have sea level rise, excessive rainfall, and you have tidal lockup when it's raining. So when it rains heavily for more than 5 hours, the tidal lockup happens, storm water cannot be discharged into the sea. So you have flash flooding. So as a government, what we've done is put in place resilient infrastructure all year round. Not just that, we're also pushing back on people who willfully chose to build on floodplains. Remove those contraventions without caring who sucks is God, ensuring that we protect our wetlands, and then ensuring that whenever we choose to prosecute, we prosecute those that are willfully destroying the ecosystem. So as a government, we're doing our bit, but we're also responding to the citizens to tell them that citizens should desist from dumping, for instance, their municipal solid waste in the drainage. It's a recipe for flood. Thank you.
Okay, so let me go to the audience and take one question.
Oh, there's a second question.
There's a second question already.
It says 2 of 2. It means we've done 1 of 1.
Yes.
So we've done half here. Let me come to you, please.
Basically, following on Laos, most of the population is basically on sea level, which is basically between 1 meter and 30 meters, basically. But if you talk about protecting the seashore, with sea level growing more than 3 meters or so, that is really not going to offer any protection to the population. So isn't that something that you have to be maybe planning a little bit ahead of that?
Okay, thank you very much. Realistically, we've lost some communities to this issue of sea level rise. Communities around the Okun Ajada, on the Lekki corridor, Idotun, have been wiped out by this ocean surge and stuff. Now, as a state, what we've experimented that worked for Lagos State is a place called the Eco-Atlantic. It used to be known as the Barbish in the years past, and it was surging to wipe out the whole of the island until 2006 or thereabout, when the former governor, who incidentally is the president of the country now, President Tinubu, chose to say, okay, you know what, we can stop this, and he brought the experts, and they built the Great Wall of Lagos, protected the whole of Victoria Island from being wiped away. Not just that, and it has become the biggest real estate investment in the country today. So we can convert these negatives to positives. But we as a people must take ownership by admitting to one thing: climate change issues are real life issues. We can't play the ostrich with them. Thank you.
Okay. My clock has been saying 000 for a while, so I guess it means we are done. If you could please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thanks. I don't know.
Please welcome our moderator, Joe Aldi, Teresa and John Hines Professor of the Practice of Environmental Policy, Adnan Amin, Chair-Designate, World Energy Council, Aranaba Ghosh, CEO, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Laurence Toubiana, President and CEO, European Climate Foundation.
Good morning. It is an absolute thrill to be here for this final session of the Harvard Climate Symposium with 3 extraordinary leaders in international climate policy. We thought it would be appropriate here, as we think about pathways for progress on energy and climate, to turn our attention to what we can do to build on the progress to date in international climate policy. I'm joined here on my far left by Laurence Toubiana. Laurence is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. She is the COP30 Special Envoy to Europe and a key architect of the Paris Agreement. We have Aranaba Ghosh, founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India, and the COP30 Special Envoy to South Asia. And Adnan Amin, who is currently the Chair-Designate of the World Energy Council COP30 Special Envoy to the Middle East, and CEO of COP28, where he oversaw the delivery of the UAE consensus. These are leaders who have been very active in the international climate negotiations in the past. They continue to engage now as the government of Brazil, in their capacity as incoming president for COP30, has tasked these individuals to liaise to stakeholders, governments, constituents in their own region to advance efforts to address climate change through the international climate policy architecture. Now, let's be candid. The world is fragmented today. Let's be candid that while we have made progress on international climate policy, it's not enough to deal fully with the threats posed by climate change. So we'd like to explore here both where we are today and what we can do to improve and enhance our efforts internationally to advance these efforts to address climate change. To set the foundation for the conversation, Laurence, I'd like to turn to you first. Share with us here, if you could, what we achieved a decade ago in Paris through the Paris Agreement, and how do you see that as serving as the foundation for climate governance moving forward?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. And you know, I was thinking maybe these climate weeks can be in the future a very important moment for understanding each other, constraint, visibility, and shaping what we have to do in the future. So this should be taken not academic exercise, but something very important. What I can just witness is with Paris Agreement 1, we have and of course that was the way it was designed to last. It's not something you change, but you have a mechanism of revision each 5 years and the global stocktake to know where we are. And at the same time, it encompasses the idea that the governments only cannot do the job, that it has to be a broad, distributed leadership, governance decisions, and that the beauty and of course the mechanism we can use to understand what the use of Paris Agreement was. Anyway, what we can witness is before Paris Agreement, even we were pointing to a 4-degree C. It's no more the case. It's still very high, but we have lower, again, on actual policies and mechanism and delivery, we have delivered at least to curb the emission trends. We, of course, not fast enough, not strong enough, but it's there. It's evident that we have now climate change everywhere in the economy, which never happened before. It's not only head of states that came now, but the investors, the economic actors, you have now national regulation almost in all the 195 countries that ratified. And that because it's come as a sort of the trend in the transformation technology and the constraint. And finally, you see, which in a way we tried to publish that recently, number of papers, of course, because of the anniversary of the 10 years, is that it has created a legal base in each country, and of course now at the International Court of Justice, as a reference point to say what is the responsibility of everyone in delivering on emission reduction and loss and damage and others. And that, you know, we didn't have any legal base before. And now you see the German government that had been sued by a number of people, and then the Constitutional Court deciding that they were wrong. And that imposed on their national law. And maybe this element, these two elements, I think Paris has delivered. One is the targets and the timelines, which is super important. That's why COP are important still. The second is that this is a signal across the economy that, of course, is now contested by people who are not happy with that. And then there is a legal foundation in national law that has happened in every country with different notions, different. And that's why finally I think these regional gatherings that these climate weeks are very important because we have to own that discussion in a sovereign space. And that's why I think the impact of climate, the global Paris Agreement has been. I do think that there's no use of negotiating everything, and it's done. The problem, of course, we know, and I'm sure my colleagues in the panel will develop that, we need the implementation element. We have a lack of accountability. Arunab has been working a lot on that recently. We need a way to not only look at each other with peer review mechanism, but maybe something stronger. in particular, and that's why I will probably in the next moment of our discussion, argues that we need to open up the tables of discussion of implementation, because it cannot be only in the official negotiation process. So absolutely, it has delivered, and I know that our conversation would be looking how we have to reform that, what kind of different building blocks we have to add. But we have to be stable on the base. The base is the targets, the long-term vision, the global stock take delivery each year, and the national ownership of the NDC, but of course the peer pressure of outside, because we need that.
Great, thank you. So of course, one of the key tasks then for countries since 2015 has been to elaborate the rule book of the Paris Agreement and begin to implement that. A few years ago in Dubai, Adnan, as CEO of COP28, that was your job, is to think through especially the first global stocktake, among other elements of the Paris framework. Share with us from your experience sort of what lessons you've learned from that and how you think we can make progress through the implementation of the Paris Agreement.
Well, let me start by saying how important Paris was. And I think those of us, not too many in this room, but those of us who are old enough to remember the disaster of Copenhagen will remember the relief of Paris, and that we were able to put this critical international agreement back on track. We were able to establish the targets that we needed, and we were able to re-establish the global consensus on how important this was and how it needed action. So in Dubai COP28, we had the first global stocktake, which was a stocktake, very intensive process to look at the implementation of the Paris Agreement and look at the direction going forward. We were fortunate because our presidency, we knew well before that we were going to have the presidency. So our runway was longer. And we had a very ambitious president who said, the only thing I want in this COP is that this has to be spectacularly successful. It has to be a game changer. It has to, any superlative you can think of. So we really engaged in a preparatory process at many different levels that was fundamental to the success of it. Let me say a little bit about that, because we look at the negotiation process, we look at what elements that are being negotiated. But what is the psychology of a process? How do you get success? And we found it's through inclusion, through creating the conditions for people to engage in a transparent process that gives them the right or the ability to feel that they are part of it, understanding what the different motivations are, and creating the framework for this to succeed. For example, in the preparatory meeting in Bonn just before our COP, they spent 3 days disagreeing on the agenda. I invested personally, I think must have had 35 heads of delegations meeting with different delegations and regional groupings just to ensure that we were able to adopt the agenda on day one and not waste 3 days of the negotiation, which can be fatal for the process. So we invested in all of these things and we started off, and the other was, our idea was, one of the things that came out of Paris was the loss and damage. And we had success in Sharm el-Sheikh, but the negotiation on the actual minutiae of this, its implementation, had got stuck. So after the last meeting, we invited them to Abu Dhabi to spend 2 days. When they still hadn't agreed on the second day, I told you the story. Yeah. It's not for public consumption, but there was a little bit of...
Our little secret.
Yeah, a little bit of verbal violence involved, and we got the agreement. And we thought that this was so significant that on the opening of the COP, if we could announce the agreement on the loss and damage facility, the confidence that would give, at least to the least developed countries, that their issues were taken more seriously would be immense. So we talked to many of the donors. And in the climate space, the developing countries are not supposed to be donors, so we're not really. But we committed $50 million on day one. The European Union came in, different countries matched that. Even the United States contributed to that. We raised pledges of $700 million for loss and damage on day one. So you can imagine that there was a sense of euphoria after the first day, which was essential because we were negotiating the next stage of climate action after Paris, which was going to be very consequential economically. So we included all different sectors of society. We brought for the first time we brought the oil companies there. We nearly got hung for it, but they were at the table. They committed to decarbonization targets very clearly, especially on methane. We brought every actor on finance and so on. But the final negotiation was very difficult because we were focusing on the next stage. And it wasn't until deadline plus X hours that we got this done. But we got, I think, we met the expectations of the president of the COP, which was this should be a transformational moment. One of the most important things was that we agreed on the economy-wide NDCs that included all greenhouse gases, that included a commitment from countries to try to keep 1.5 within reach, that looked at targets for emissions reductions that were substantially higher. All of these agreed, but most of all, that as we look forward, for the first time in any climate agreement ever, the words transitioning away from fossil fuels were part of the agreement. And I think that is the most consequential part of this agreement. There are many other elements, I don't want to go into those, but this part on the energy transition, talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels, then the suite of approaches that would be part of this provides a comprehensive roadmap for us to decarbonization. So at this point, as we move forward, if the political will to implement that can be found, then I think we will still be able to meet the ambitions of the Paris Agreement.
Great, thanks. So in Paris, for the first time, the UNFCCC negotiators said it's not just about we national governments are going to do. We want to engage, in the language of Paris, so-called non-state actors. So it could be the oil and gas companies who you brought in, but in general, it's both the private sector, it's sub-national governments, it's civil society. Aruna, this is something you've worked on. In fact, you were tasked by the Secretary General to a high-level experts group to look at what the goals are that various non-state actors are undertaking. How do we ensure that they are accountable and credible? How do we think about this emerging role where we have nation states negotiating, but we realize at the end of the day, progress is going to be made in large part by actions by these other players. Give us some insights about that, how that's evolved since 2015 with Paris and where it can go in the future.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. As Laurence said, the framework of the Paris Agreement, it rests on not just what the governments negotiate, but others implement. And the governments have a role in sending out the signal, but it's the private sector, it's investors, innovators, risk takers, and subnational governments who have to make sure that we are pursuing the targets. Now, why is this important? You can think of non-state actors in a few different categories. You can think of those who are sort of the non-controversial ones, those who are anyway going and deploying clean energy infrastructure. So they're winning from this new architecture. Then you have those who are completely losing, right? Who have a very different investment in the economy as it stands. And then there are those in the middle who are users of the energy, but are actually their end product is something else. They're making steel, they're making cars, etc. And I think the way to focus on the efforts of each of these categories is different. Even for the kind of so-called non-controversial category, you've got to make sure that your commitments, whether you are deploying clean energy or you need to do it responsibly, you've got to make sure that you're not violating biodiversity and so forth. But let's leave that aside. Let's talk about the other two categories and what the UN Secretary General gave as a one-line homework to the high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state actors. It's a long title.
Yes.
Was draw a red line under greenwashing.
Okay.
Now, how do you draw a red line under greenwashing? I think that's easily said than done. You start by looking at what are they committing. Are they committing and what are they committing? And you began to, and this was a group led by Catherine McKenna, former Environment Minister of Canada. And we saw that there were several thousand companies promising to get to net zero by 2050, some even suggesting they'd get there sooner. Okay, if you made the promise, how credible is it? And the credibility of the promise depended not on what you would do by 2050, but what would you do by 2025? What would you do by 2030? What would you do by 2035? So in the same kind of cycles of corporate investment and boardroom decisions and investor calls, you can be asked those questions. Right? Then comes the issue of how are you going to be held accountable? Now, of course, accountability can be internal, again, by your own investors or by your own board of directors. It can be external. Laurence referred to legal issues, legislation, but also legal action, etc. And then we said there's more to this. And the more to this is the easiest way to demonstrate that you're not a sincere player is if your first action is actually to buy out an offset somewhere else so that you don't have to do something today. And we try to put some guardrails on the kind of conditions under which offsets could be used. There's no question that many of these hard-to-abate sectors are hard to abate. I mean, in India, steel, cement, fertilizer, petrochemicals account for 3/4 of our industrial emissions. If you don't solve for those, the rest really doesn't matter. So we said, you've got to demonstrate what is it that you can do within the scope of your business, and then what you can't do, what's the residual emissions, that's where you start looking at the offset market. Then there was one more component, which was actually about what do you do for your long supply chains? If you're an automobile company, someone else is making your tires, someone else is making your steering wheels, etc. So this scope 2 and scope 3 emissions issue was something that, again, had to be spotlighted. And then finally, we talked about just transition. Just transition means, in the context of non-state actors, what do you do for the communities within which you're operating? So it was a 10-point kind of agenda that we outlined, that it's not enough just to say we're going to get to net zero. I want to make one more point and then I'll close, which is non-state actors are not just companies. And you referred to this. There's provinces. When in the United States, you have some states that say we are carrying on, but my country has 28 states. China has many provinces, etc. So what happens at a provincial and state level matters for large, complex economies. My organization has been developing and working with state governments in 20 of our 28 states. We've modeled net zero pathways for many of them. Some have committed to net zero before 2070, which is the India target. Some are looking at, can we even get there even sooner? So that matters. And finally, because Adnan referred to loss and damage, the real issue about resilience is actually not just states, it's actually city-level action. How do you prevent a city from being inundated with floods, etc.? So the role of non-state actors there becomes extremely important. We have developed over 150 heat action plans for Indian cities at a neighborhood by neighborhood level. So then you know what to do, what kind of standards are there for cooling shelters, what kind of budgetary allocation have we made to do a flood protection plan implemented or a heat protection plan implemented. So non-state actors are really all of us. We are the composites of very complex democracies. And the point was that if we want others to act, we've got to draw a red line under our own potential greenwashing.
Right. Arnab's comments make me think about almost every session yesterday. You know, yesterday, a lot of it was more US focused, but we had these conversations with business leaders where they did talk about some of their voluntary emission reduction goals and those efforts. We had a breakout session that focused on how do we manage heat stress, another one on insurance that helps try to enhance resilience. But I think it's one thing that as we've seen the international architecture evolve, it makes sort of more substantial connections to the actions on the ground by companies, by cities, by state and provincial governments. And I think that's going to be important as we evaluate how effective the international architecture is by creating that kind of impetus for this progress.
Totally.
Now, we've talked about the institutional design, but coming out of discussing some of the institutional design we have now is the importance of the strategy. The strategy of having, I guess, a clearly set goal. You better succeed, Adnan. That's what I heard from your boss and in your remarks. You better succeed and it better be good. But importantly, how you engage the various players leading into the negotiations is important. You have each been tasked by the government of Brazil to be a special envoy to your respective regions. Share with us a little bit about what the government of Brazil has asked of you and what you've done in those consultations to try to support the government as it plans to host the COP here in just a few weeks.
First, I think it's a very interesting innovation. And that surprised everybody that somebody from a region begin to be in between. Not from the Brazilian side, but not from the side of its own region. And so, of course, you imagine the question of a negotiator, what are you doing there? Are you replacing me or not? So it was an interesting conversation to say, look, I can explain to the Brazilian constituencies the internal political economy of Europe and its difficulties or its potential, but at the same time explain the demands on Europe from others. And we cannot ignore these demands. So that was the first, in a way, political role. The second one was, in a way, to see what can Europe bring to the table, because we know that this process has to evolve, just because of the discussion we had immediately. And that's why, of course, you see now in Europe, you have different perception. Some business think that the technology, the transition is there, they benefit from it, they want the regulation to stick, to continue doing their job properly. You have, of course, powerful states, some federal cases, like Germany, for example, at the same time, or cities that are doing the job, and some most of the time, as Arunaba mentioned, with more ambitious targets than their own government for obvious reasons. And so, to encourage them to bring their ideas, there is a demand that now that is more concrete, that why we should come to COP, if it's just to, as a fair, to present our ideas. Where is our role? And how finally we make the difference between the one who really want this to happen and take this global stake as a global stake for them. And it's a question that finally in our work of Envoy, we receive that question. What's the value for a governor of a state or a province to go to COP is just to do, you know, like a big conversation. So this element is forcing us to say we need reform on the process. And so I don't know what the next COP will take place because it's not set up, or the next presidency would decide. But I think finally I was surprised myself. And it was an innovation and a co-creation because clearly, and my Brazilian colleagues here know that, we were inventing the role on the spot. And finally, it was so useful because I do think that now to improve the global climate level policy and politics, we need to have this ownership on the population, first on the citizen, because they are affected by the climate change impact. They know that it's not tomorrow, it's now. So we have to have their voice really represented very strongly. It's not a global thing, it's really embedded in the regions. The second element is we have to begin to coalesce in very fragmented world, as you mentioned. Who are the ones that will push for that more, to, in a way, decide to support the transition, again, the one who would like to delay or not to do it. And so we need to create these networks. And so we started in our region, and now, of course, the value would be to connect them. So I don't think it's a one-off. Yeah. I don't know what the presidency would do, But I think it's really important now to connect the ones that continue. And that's what everybody talk about. What do we do for enforcement of the Paris Agreement with not only governments at the table?
Adnan, what's your experience been as an envoy?
Well, you know, I've always been a fan of Brazilian football. I think you call it soccer. And it's the opposite of German, the machine, the well-oiled, structured, chewing everything up. The Brazilians do magic, you know, and they're the same in diplomacy. I've known them for a long time in the way they do it. So they're dealing with a very specific now situation for their COP. With the Dubai COP28, we essentially completed the negotiation of the Paris Rule Book. So all of the different elements, except for the NCQG, were in place. The platform for the NCQG, the next generation of climate finance, was put in place. It was agreed in Azerbaijan. So from the negotiation side, there's not that much for them to do. You know, there are a few residual elements on adaptation, just transition, and so on, which are important. But there's no fundamental, important, intergovernmental, hardcore negotiation issue. The most important thing for this COP in Brazil is going to be the presentation of the NDCs. This is the commitment that people took in COP28 in Dubai, that the next generation of NDCs,
The sort of country-wide emission goals for those countries.
Yes, nationally determined contributions to the goal, which are multi-sectoral. They include agriculture, industry, different elements of the economy, and their strategy for how they're going to reach the emissions reductions there. So the opportunity for doing it differently is there. How do we create a platform for the review of the NDCs? But more importantly, how do we create a platform for international cooperation in all of the very encouraging trends that we're seeing happening? You know, if you just look at energy transition, this first 6 months of this year, we've added, 380 gigawatts of renewable energy. 6 months. Of course, 250 of that is in China. Right. But that's impressive. We're on for, close to 800 gigawatts by the end of the year. We're on for annually adding 1 terawatt, which was the dream always of renewable power. Costs have come down. Innovation has driven new solutions. Electric mobility, battery storage, these are all become cost competitive. The cost curves of these are extraordinary. The same way we saw with solar. As scale went up, prices fell. It's happening across the board. How do we make this a global phenomenon? How do we create a platform for sharing this? So for the Brazilians, who have always been very vested in the actual negotiation side, the challenge now is how do we create the platform for implementation of the NDCs? How do we encourage the adoption of the NDCs? And they have to design a very interesting action agenda, like we did in Dubai also, by the way, and you were there. You saw how we got different sectors, health, agriculture, food security, forestry, oil and gas. Everybody was part of the solution. So they have to create a platform like that advances implementation. The real contribution COP hosts, COP presidencies in the future are going to make is not shepherding the negotiation. It's about what the future looks like. So I spent a lot of time with them recently. I was in Brasilia for what we call the end game workshop.
Okay.
It's not as apocalyptic as it sounds. It's how do you manage that last part of that process?
You mean the 24 hours that last 72 hours?
Yeah, it was a very, very difficult time of the COP. But how do you manage that? What's the feasible outcomes? And that the focus should be on these practical outcomes. And I, with my energy background, I was specifically focusing on energy because I think there's a huge amount that we can achieve on that. But they're committed to forestry, agriculture. Their approach to energy includes different elements of the energy ecosystem people haven't previously highlighted, biomass and so on, clean fuels. So I think they're preparing an innovative program. So our job is also to support them in that. but also to support them with the diplomacy and outreach to our respective regions. In my case, it's basically, I'm the Saudi whisperer.
Okay.
So the others will come along. Right. But it's a question of ensuring that our region also continues the commitment it made during COP28 to support the process and comes with ambition. And we're seeing that. A lot of countries from the region are now preparing themselves for this COP. They want to showcase what they're doing. And believe me, I think it's not evident in media and so on, but the kind of investments that we're seeing in clean technologies and decarbonization in the Middle Eastern region today is remarkable. I mean, I would have never believed it 2 or 3 years ago. But that's the shape of business for the future, the articulation of clean technology, artificial intelligence, and smart investment.
Great.
Well, I've been on a listening tour, and as Lawrence was saying, we are kind of flying this plane as we are building it, or vice versa. So the approach I've taken is, let's talk to the countries in my region, South Asia. I've spoken to state actors, non-state actors, academics, think tanks, businesses, and I see 3 things. That one is that, Adnan used the metaphor of soccer. I'll use the metaphor of the other sport we love in South Asia, which is cricket. You've got a leather ball, someone's chucking at it, you.
Not playing cricket, no.
Yeah. With and it's coming at you at 90 miles per hour. So what are those climate cricket balls that are coming at you at 90 miles per hour? And in a highly vulnerable region like South Asia, you hear everything from coastal inundation in, say, Maldives or Sri Lanka, to recognizing that the Himalayas are the newest and therefore the kind of most vulnerable mountain system in the world. So in fact, Bhutan, Nepal, and others have actually been thinking about, let's bring attention on, how vulnerable mountainous regions are. And of course, there's glaciers, etc. So understanding climate risk from a regional perspective is critical. My own organization is developing India's first high-resolution climate risk atlas. The second thing is really showcasing what the region is doing. And this often gets missed out, not just for, Adnan just referred to the Middle East as well. A lot gets missed out in the sort of fog of climate negotiations. India, just a few weeks ago, crossed its 50% non-fossil capacity target from non-fossil fuels, 5 years ahead of schedule. There's been a huge surge of distributed solar in Pakistan. There's been efforts on adaptation and resilience in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, etc. So bringing those stories in a way that is not just a feel-good anecdote, but is analytically robust, is something I've putting a lot of effort into. And the third is actually the non-COP part of this. And this is where I completely agree with Lawrence. I hope there's a continuation of this process. Because what happens, there's 2 weeks in the year you have COP negotiations. There's 50 other weeks in the year where you have action. How do we take ideas that emerge from this process and create coordination sort of platforms within the region? And I'm hearing things like, let's pool our NDCs. Let's create a resilience investment facility. Let's create a technology hub. All sorts of ideas. Not everything will see the light of day. But you clearly see a strong desire to keep at it. And that is not the narrative you mostly pick up when you only see what a negotiator is saying inside a very heated negotiating chamber.
Great, thanks. Now, I want to look a little bit beyond November. When we sort of think about the risk of climate change, people have noted that last year was the warmest on record, a little bit more than 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial average. There are some people who use the term climate overshoot as the period we're about to go into, meaning that we will be realizing temperatures and warming that exceed the goals that we established in the Paris Agreement. Laurence, you were on this ad hoc climate overshoot commission, trying to think through ideas on how to manage the risk in this period. And probably among the, if not the most controversial, was the idea about thinking about solar geoengineering. One option would be to put particles into the upper atmosphere and deflect incoming sunlight. Share with us what the Commission recommended. And then I'd like us to have a little bit of a discussion about the governance of this technology, because we've been talking about ways to reduce emissions, enhance resilience, address the risk of a change in climate that we realize on the ground. But this topic of solar geoengineering has not been the topic of any UNFCCC negotiations. So Laurence, what did you and your colleagues on the Commission recommend with respect to solar geoengineering?
Happy to discuss that, and I know the time is running. But just to remind us, at COP30, we have to decide that we have to add building blocks to the climate governance regime. We have to have the non-state actors at the table for the enforcement. We have to relate that these non-state actors' activities has to be related to the NDCs. So that could be, by the way, something interesting if India finally takes the job in 2 years' time. And we have really to have the, because everything will be on expectation. The expectation that are now, we are in a battle of information, and that the solar radiation management is part of it. Huh? We are in a battle, I would not like to say cultural battle, but it's almost there, that we have an information battle that say we cannot do anything. Anyway, it's not safe, security is building business as usual, and we will find a remedy to that. I think we have to have this battle in COP30 to say, no, the expectation can be shaped differently. The trend of technology are there, as you said. And so we have to bet on the new cycle of climate activity. So that just to say, COP30 is a turning point for me. Stop the propaganda against climate action and build the next cycle for Belém +10. That's true that part of these anxieties about the overshoot, the 1.5 we have passed, at least for 1 year this year, creates ideas that we cannot wait, we have to operate. That was the reason what this commission was created, with, in a way, making the difference between carbon removal, which is different, and with, of course, this problem of putting particles high in the atmosphere as a quick fix, not expensive, that's true, to have planes rotating around the planet to put these particles above. And with a perception of the risk of this temperature rise is so high that we should undervaluate the other risks we don't know, because we don't know, the science is not there. So the commission, it was a very, 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 very intense debate all over the 2 years. Arnaud prepared them because he was in the first phase. There was enthusiastic about the technology, saying it's cheap, we can do that, we have to have deployment. You should allow this to have a big deployment at scale. And the other one would say, yeah, but what the impacts are? How about the acidification of ocean? How do, again, the non-intended consequences, because we don't have the science of the impact of this technology. So what we wanted is a moratorium of the deployment first, before knowing more on the impact. Second, a collective management. It cannot be a national, whatever nation powerful is, decision only. And just to say that, it could be a major risk of creating conflict today. If some country decided, or even a company decided to do that on its own, just because it's just safe to have a little control of the temperature. So it is just, this technology is like artificial intelligence or genetics, no? It's so broad impact that you need to have at least a collective decision on transparency on research, transparency on the essays, and in a way, a collective governance of it. The response to our proposal was, oh, it's too complicated. We never get there. You know, UN is so complicated. No. We did that for other major issues, but this is a very big challenge. So the moratorium deployment and a good collective conversation on research and transparency is very important, in particular in this place, who has generated most of this research.
Great. I'd like to go to Arnaba next, because you're advising the UK government, which has a research program. Share with us a little bit about your thoughts about the governance of research on this technology.
Well, I've written about the governance of solar geoengineering for 15 years, and I agree with Laurence. If you are going to consider technologies that have planetary scale impact, then its governance also has to be designed in a way that has planetary scale involvement. Now, that does not necessarily mean, you know, you have to only go down a UN route, et cetera. You have many options. You can have self-regulation. A group of scientists can say, you know, we will follow a certain bunch of principles. You can have national level regulation, and but I think, or you can see, you know, can a certain UN agency add to its mandate or what it does. I think what is needed is a new way of thinking about this. We have to design the governance along with the research. So it has to be a two-step tango, but with a recognition that the risks are not just many, but of many dimensions. There's first-order risk, second-order risk, third-order risk. There's unknown unknowns we're dealing with. So what do? Number one, you need radical transparency. And not just about the research. Start with transparency about the funding. Who is funding with what intentionality? Number two, what actually is the objective of the research program? Number three, what are you going to do with it? Suppose your research results were encouraging in a certain way. Immediately, you then get other actors that have to get involved. In addition to that, you have issues of, are you inclusive in this approach? Where is the intellectual property going to rest? Is this going to be the next multi-trillion-dollar privatized approach towards fixing the planet, or is it something else? When you start considering all of these, at least I am on the oversight committee of the Exploring Climate Cooling Options program as part of the UK's Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And these are some of the principles that have been articulated, that it will be open funding, collaborative, not just restricted to the UK, intellectual property will not be appropriated, and things like that. So I'm not saying that's the only route, but I think we have to be a little bit more serious about governance, especially when these are not ahistorical challenges we're dealing with. There's a lot of distrust in global governance of climate promises not being met, et cetera. So when you think of this as, oh, my only intention is to fix the world and save the planet, that's not how it's perceived in many other geographies and amongst many other stakeholders.
Great. So we have about 90 seconds left. So I want to finish with a lightning round, and then I'm going to go to you first. So about 30 seconds each. If you could change one thing in global climate diplomacy that would facilitate faster progress in cutting emissions, what would that be?
I think I would change all the negotiators in there for 20 years. But because people get so tied up into their own logic of their ideas that you don't get fresh thinking. So I think we have the opportunity now to get out of that, tit for tat negotiation phase. And by the way, put geoengineering into the UN, I feel safe because for 20 years nothing is going to happen. But I think moving international cooperation using the climate process to advance concrete implementation of the agenda that we have agreed through the NDCs should be the focus for the future.
Great. Arnab.
I think non-state actors should be at the table in some way, but a formulation I wrote about a couple of weeks ago is, one, we need internal transformation, we need legislation at home, we need strategic bilateralism between major countries to start looking at different parts of the problem they can solve. And then we need smart plurilateralism, whether it's for sectors, for geographies, et cetera. Those three pillars can help to re-inject the trust that we need for a renewed multilateralism. If we start with that top-down approach, then we are undermining all of the other action that is happening and is possible round up.
Thank you. Laurent.
So, agree with Adnan. Maybe the negotiators we should find them another activity to play with.
Yeah, but don't show this to them, by the way.
No, exactly. I think one is really to use fully the Paris Agreement framework, now creating the links between this very distributed leadership. Just one example. international financial architecture reform. It's done, it has been asked in Sharm, then in Dubai. Now we have a mechanism to report to the UNFCCC. So creating the connection first. Second, as Arunaba said, and you just having the non-state actors as a table of enforcement within the Paris Agreement logic, which is the global stocktake, the revision of different commitments, plus accountability. And the third one, in my view, is really to have much more people involved, because who are the ones that can push the government now to think more long-term or mid-term? So affected people should be formally represented in the process. And I do think this will change the perception that anyway, we can't do anything, which is a fatalism, or anyway, that's not important and we should look elsewhere. And we need the people's voice, because I do think now you see where society has the energy, it's at local level, much more than at the political level. So we need to find a way through maybe regional or national assemblies, through maybe these global assemblies that the COP30 presidency is supporting and organizing, to have the direct people voice, because people says climate policy is a policy of elites against people, and we have to demonstrate that it's not that, at the contrary. The one who are suffering are the people, not the vested interest.
Great, thank you. Please join me in thanking Adnan, Arunaba, Laurence for their insights and for their continued service. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So it is my pleasure and privilege to reintroduce my colleague, Jim Stock. As Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability and the Director of the Salata Institute, Jim has built a community at Harvard, leveraging the strengths of our faculty, our students, our staff, and our alumni to bring our tools, talents, and energy to drive progress in addressing climate change. As a leader and a thought partner, we have benefited from Jim's challenges, motivations, and just insurmountable support for what we can do to try to advance our work in the service of addressing climate change. His commitment to Harvard and to this role that we play through our research, our teaching, and our engagement to make the world better inspires me and our colleagues. Please join me again in welcoming Jim Stock back to the stage.
Thank you, Joe, for those very generous words. I'm really excited about and energized from this conference. I will quote Adnan Amin's phrase, which is that we need to have fresh thinkers. I'm not sure I want to throw all of my colleagues out of the room, and to generate that, actually, I want to tap into them and inspire them, and I think that this conference has been, or this symposium has been very inspiring in that way. In addition to needing fresh thinking, we need communication, such as we have here. We need a shared vision for how we can move forward. And then we need to have the inspiration and then the elbow grease to actually make that happen. And I think that we've seen that in all of the sessions today. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank some people who've been absolutely tremendous. The staff has really done a fantastic job making this happen. Nancy Baccia for events logistics, Sarah Vilnett for technology, Tori Hussain is our student intern who organized all of the volunteers to really make this happen. A number of people on our team really pitched in across the board. Sandra Schumann, Amy Sisson, Jennifer Malloy, and Zoe Stone all solved one issue after another and really made this happen. But there are two people who I want to thank, particularly Thais Pinheiro. Thais, are you here? Where is Thais? Thais really stepped up in a staffing situation where we didn't have as many people as perhaps we wanted to make this all happen, and just did some huge heavy lifting. And we're incredibly grateful for all of the professionalism and dedication and the success. And then I'd also like to thank Joe Aldi. Joe, who you've met in a couple of sessions, is the faculty chair of the Climate Action Accelerator Faculty Steering Committee, and he did yeoman's work putting together the program and working with people and then being persistent with one speaker after another and really making sure that this happened and provided an overarching intellectual framework. So, Joe, thank you very much. And let me thank you, the audience. It is fantastic that you've been here. I hope that you, I hope that you've been able to make connections. And I also hope that you've been, like I have been, inspired and stimulated and motivated. I think that this has affirmed the importance of driving forward with practical solutions to climate problems. That's the work that we do every day at the Sloan Institute, and that's the work that I hope that you all will continue to do. Thank you very much.